I never expected a solo hiking trip to be anything more than a challenge, a quiet getaway, something to push myself a little harder. I had been hiking for years, mostly local trails and a few backcountry spots in Oregon and Northern California. Nothing dangerous, just long and tough trails, sometimes through rain or cold, sometimes up steep ridgelines with sore legs and a heavy pack. I was always careful, always well-packed, and always kept someone in the loop of where I'd be. This trip was supposed to be my last long hike of the season before winter hit. It was late October. The nights were already cold, but the forecast looked dry. The trail I chose was a rugged route that cut through a series of ridges in eastern Washington. Not one of the heavily trafficked places. The route was long, just under 40 miles round trip, mostly along a narrow trail that followed a winding, rocky ridgeline through deep forest on one side and open canyon on the other. It had been used mostly by hunters and a few trail runners earlier in the season. This late in the year, though, it was empty. I got to the trailhead mid-morning. There was only one other truck in the lot, an old red Chevy with a bunch of faded hunting stickers on the back window. No people in sight. I double-checked the map, strapped on my pack, locked my car, and started up the path. The first 5 miles were steady incline through thick pine woods, damp earth, and needle-covered trail. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath a little when I stopped moving. There were patches of ice in the shaded areas, thin and cracking under my boots. I made decent time, passing over a few small creeks and winding switchbacks, climbing higher toward the ridgeline that ran north-south for almost 12 miles. My plan was to follow the ridge, camp overnight somewhere around the midpoint, and then finish the loop back down on the other side. Around mid-afternoon, I made it to the top of the first ridge. The view was everything I wanted, miles of hills rolling off in all directions, thick pine forest stretching out endlessly, and that kind of silence that's almost too quiet. I ate a protein bar, drank some water, and checked my map again. Still on track. I pushed forward. The trail narrowed as I went, and the wind started to pick up a little. There were long sections where the ridge dropped off steeply on either side. To my right, a deep gorge filled with trees and brush and bare stone. To my left, a slope that dropped into heavy forest. The ground was uneven, sometimes soft, sometimes rock. The ridgeline trail wasn't maintained regularly, so there were places where roots and rocks stuck out or parts of the path had eroded away. It was close to dusk when I found a flat section of trail just off the ridgeline, behind a group of thick pines. I cleared some space and pitched my small tent. I didn't build a fire, too windy and not really necessary. I cooked some dehydrated food with my camp stove, stretched out, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The first night was quiet, just the wind blowing through the trees and the occasional rustle of branches. Probably deer or rabbits. I woke up once to pee, my breath fogging the air outside the tent. The stars sharp and bright overhead, the moon just a sliver. I was back asleep quickly. The next morning, frost coated my tent. I packed up fast, my fingers stiff with cold, and got moving early to warm up. The trail sloped downward for a while, curving through a narrow pass before climbing again. The wind picked up hard around noon, and I had to stop a few times to brace myself in the more exposed sections. It was early afternoon when I first saw something that felt off. I came around a bend where the trail narrowed between two outcrops of stone, and on the other side, about 50 yards ahead, I saw something lying near the edge of the trail. It was dark, tangled looking. I walked slowly toward it, cautious without knowing why. When I got close enough, I saw it was a shredded pack, ripped and torn open like it had been pulled apart. The straps were frayed, the frame twisted. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle nearby, just the ruined pack lying in the dirt and pine needles. Some gear had been scattered, an empty water bottle, a crushed headlamp, a pair of gloves. No footprints nearby except my own. I stood there for a long time just staring. My first thought was that maybe it had been dropped or rolled down the slope and torn up on rocks. But it hadn't fallen. It looked like it had been yanked apart. The gloves were 10 feet from the pack. The headlamp was half buried. It didn't look like an accident. I should have turned around then. I should have taken it as a sign that something was wrong and headed straight back the way I came. But I didn't. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a bear had gotten to someone's pack. Maybe it had been left behind weeks ago. I stepped around it and kept going. The trail started climbing again. The forest thinned, and I followed the ridgeline across a stretch of exposed rock. There were cairns spaced every 50 feet or so to mark the way. The wind-up there was louder, constant. I had to lean into it to keep my balance. By late afternoon, the trail dipped again and I came into a wide area where the trees grew thick on both sides and the ridge flattened. I planned to camp there. I set up in a spot tucked against a large boulder, using it as a windbreak. As I unpacked, I kept thinking about that pack. Couldn't shake it. I kept listening, too, waiting for something, voices, movement, even animals. Nothing came. Just the wind and the creak of trees in the distance. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bag, fully zipped, eyes open. The wind seemed louder than before, and at one point I thought I heard something else mixed in. A crunch of leaves, a quick, sudden shift of movement outside the tent. I froze. My hand crept to the knife I kept near me while camping. I didn't move for over an hour, just listening, heart pounding, staring at the tent ceiling in the dark. Nothing happened. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep. The next morning, I found prints. They weren't mine. They were spaced differently, larger, heavy impressions, deeper than what I'd made, and they circled the spot where I had camped. At least 4 or 5 passes, back and forth. In some places, the prints overlapped my own from when I had arrived. That meant someone had come through during the night. Someone had walked around my tent while I was inside. There were no other signs, no trash, no gear, no marks of camp. Just those prints. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. The cold didn't bother me. I didn't even move. I just stood and looked, trying to make sense of it. The trail was supposed to be empty. The other car at the trailhead was days old. No one should have been there. I packed in less than 5 minutes. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just shoved everything into my bag, tightened the straps, and started moving fast. I was about halfway through the loop, and I could either keep going and finish or turn around and backtrack. I chose to backtrack. It would be longer, but it felt safer. I knew the terrain. I'd already passed through it. I didn't want to find out what or who was ahead of me on the rest of the ridge. The hike back was brutal. I didn't stop except to drink water and catch my breath now and then. Every sound made me turn around. At one point, I thought I saw movement down the slope to the left. Just a flash, something dark moving between the trees. I stared for a long time. Nothing came out. I kept going. By late afternoon, I was back near the spot where I'd seen the torn-up pack. But it was gone. There was nothing there now. No pack, no gloves, no scattered gear. Just a bare patch of ground where I remembered it had been. I checked the GPS. I was in the right place. I stood still, trying to understand. It was gone. Someone had taken it, or come back for it. That was the first time I truly felt panic set in. I started jogging the trail at that point, even with the pack heavy on my back. I tripped more than once, scraped my palms and knees on the dirt and stone, but I didn't care. I needed to get out. I needed to see people, hear cars, anything but the sound of wind and my own footsteps. I didn't stop again until dusk, when the cold became too much and I couldn't move any farther. I found a narrow alcove in the rock on the side of the ridge and crawled into it. No tent. I didn't want anything that would trap me. I ate cold food, barely chewed, and kept my knife in my hand the entire night. I didn't sleep. At one point deep in the night, I heard something again. Not wind, not trees. Movement. Slow, careful, close. Something brushing against rock, crunching over pine needles, maybe 10 or 15 feet from where I lay hidden. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I stayed frozen, knife clenched in my hand, until the sound faded again. It didn't come back. When morning came, I crawled out of that spot and didn't stop moving. Every step hurt. My legs burned. My shoulders ached. But I didn't care. I just kept going. No water breaks. No food. Just forward. It was almost noon when I reached the trailhead. The red truck was still there. But something was different. There were deep scratches on the driver's side door. Long ones like from a blade or claws or some kind of metal edge. I went up to it slowly. The windows were fogged over. I looked inside. There was a I don't know what made me think it was a good idea to do a long solo hike that deep in the mountains. Maybe I was just tired of the same routine back in the city. Every day looked the same: wake up, eat, work, scroll on my phone, go to sleep. I started feeling stuck. I thought maybe getting out alone, away from all the noise, would help me clear my head. Something quiet, something hard, something far away from everything. I had done hikes before, plenty of day hikes and a couple overnighters. I wasn't a total beginner, but I wasn't some mountain man either. I just liked the quiet and the focus hiking gave me. And for some reason, this time I wanted to go deeper and longer. No crowds, no phones, no stress, just a pack, some gear, and 5 days in the backcountry. I picked a spot in a big forested area out west. Lots of canyons, cliffs, dense pines, rugged terrain. Not a popular place. Most people stuck to the trails closer to the highway or the campgrounds. I picked a loop trail that started gentle, then cut through remote areas that barely showed up on the maps. I had my printed topo map, GPS, emergency beacon, extra food, water filter, the works. I thought I was ready. I drove out the night before and slept in the back of my car near the trailhead. In the morning, I packed up, locked my car, and started walking. The trailhead was quiet, just a dusty gravel lot surrounded by trees. I signed the register like you're supposed to. I even wrote down my return date, back by Sunday. That was 5 days away. I had plenty of food, planned my route carefully, and marked water sources. It was dry that time of year, so I had to be smart about it. The first day felt great. Long switchbacks through tall pine trees, the ground soft with needles. The sun came through in sharp beams, and I saw no one the whole day. Just birds, squirrels, a couple deer in the distance. My pack felt heavy but manageable. I drank water slowly, saving it until I reached the creek I had marked on my map. I got there around 4 in the afternoon. The water was clear and cold, running through smooth rocks. I filtered 2 liters and set up camp nearby. I found a flat spot under some trees, hung my food in a tree branch, and stretched out. The breeze moved through the trees, and I lay there with my head on my pack, just breathing. I felt peace for the first time in weeks. The second day got harder. The trail started climbing, winding through exposed rocky areas. No trees for shade, just scrub brush and dry dirt. I passed an old fire scar where a wildfire had burned through years ago, blackened trunks still standing like skeletons. It was quiet there. I didn't like how quiet it was. I couldn't even hear insects. I kept moving. My legs were sore by late afternoon, and I found a ridge that looked out over a valley. The view was massive, endless trees, hills stacked behind each other, everything tinted orange in the sunset. I cooked a simple meal on my little stove and sat on a rock watching the sky change colors. I felt small, but in a good way. That night, the wind picked up, and my tent flapped hard until I cinched it tighter. By the third day, I was deep in it. No signs of other people. The trail narrowed until it was barely a path. Sometimes I had to check my map just to be sure I wasn't off track. I didn't mind. That was the point of coming out here, to get away. I crossed a shallow ravine and stopped for water at a muddy little stream. The bugs were bad, but I filtered a couple liters anyway. I had to keep an eye on my supply. I had marked another creek further up, but if it was dry, I'd be in trouble. I hiked until my legs ached. The sun was low when I found a spot beneath a group of fir trees. No wind, no animals, just a quiet patch of dirt and pine needles. That night something woke me, a sound, not loud, just off, like branches cracking far away. Then silence again. I lay still, my heart picking up. Probably just a deer, I told myself, or wind, maybe a raccoon. Still, I didn't fall back asleep for a while. I just stared up through the thin tent walls, waiting to hear it again. By the 4th day, things started to go wrong. I woke early and packed up fast, wanting to make it to the next marked water source before the heat kicked in. My water was down to half a liter. I checked the map, confirmed the direction, and started hiking. The terrain was rough. More climbs, loose dirt, overgrown brush clawing at my legs. After about 2 hours, I realized something didn't feel right. The trail was fading. At first, I thought I'd lost it in a brushy patch, but even after checking the GPS, I wasn't where I thought I'd be. I tried correcting, backtracking, watching for old trail markers, but they were gone. The GPS signal was bouncing, probably the cliffs and trees messing with it. I pulled out my compass and map and tried triangulating. I must have taken a wrong fork an hour back. I cursed under my breath and kept moving. By then I was thirsty, legs tired, and the sun was punishing. I pushed through thorny underbrush and scrambled over rocks, finally reaching what should have been a spring. But it was dry, just cracked earth and a few twisted branches. No water, no sound. My throat was dry, and I was sweating hard. I sat down in the shade of a dead tree and stared at the map. I had misjudged how remote this part was. The next marked water was almost 5 miles away, across more rugged ground. I had maybe 1 or 2 good sips left. I rationed it, took 1 slow swallow, just enough to wet my mouth. Then I got up and started moving. That part of the hike is a blur now. Just hours of stumbling, heat pressing on my back, every step feeling heavier. I stopped sweating at one point, which I knew was bad. My tongue felt thick. I kept checking the map, making little corrections, hoping I was still going the right way. Late in the day, I saw a slope I didn't recognize. The map didn't match what was in front of me. I had no clue where I was. I sat down, dry-mouthed, dizzy. I looked around and realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in hours. Everything looked the same: trees, dirt, rocks. I had wandered off course trying to shortcut toward water. I thought I could handle it. I thought I knew better. But now I was lost. Really lost. I made camp that night in silence. I had no appetite. Just chewed a granola bar and forced it down. I didn't even set up the tent. Just lay out under the sky, staring at the stars until my eyes closed. The next morning, I woke up early, cold, sore, and still without water. I knew I had to fix this. No more wandering. I needed to stop, find shade, and use the emergency beacon. But part of me didn't want to. That beacon was the last resort. If I pressed it, search and rescue would come. It would mean I failed. I sat there staring at it in my hand. Then I heard something. A noise in the distance. Not an animal. Not the wind. It sounded like something man-made. I stood and listened. It was faint. A metal clinking sound. Like something banging irregularly. I couldn't tell what direction, but I turned slowly, trying to triangulate. Then I heard it again, sharper this time, like something striking metal. I thought maybe it was another hiker, maybe someone at a fire lookout, or someone fixing a fence. I moved toward it. The ground dropped steeply into a canyon, and I had to scramble down loose dirt and rocks. I slipped once, scraping my hand, but the sound was clearer now, maybe 200 yards ahead. I moved faster, pushing through dense brush. Then I saw it. A rusted metal tank, partially buried in the dirt, with a collapsed wooden shack nearby. An old backcountry mining site. I approached slowly. The place looked abandoned. Tools scattered, a rusted wheelbarrow, beams fallen over. But someone had been here recently. I saw a footprint in the dust, fresh, near one of the beams. I looked around and saw a narrow path leading downhill behind the site. I followed it. Then I heard it again, the metal sound. But this time it was clear what it was. A shovel striking rock. Someone was digging. I crept forward, heart pounding. Around the bend, I saw a man in a wide hat, shirtless, swinging a shovel into the rocky ground beside another collapsed structure. He didn't look up. I stood there watching, not sure what to do. I hadn't seen another person in days, and now here was someone in the middle of nowhere, digging into rock like it was the most normal thing in the world. I took a step forward and stepped on a stick. The man froze. His head turned slightly, then fully, and he looked right at me. His face was sunburned, thin, eyes sunken. He stared for a long moment, then turned back to the dirt and kept digging. I backed away. Something about him felt wrong. Not just because he was out there. It was how he didn't seem surprised. Like he expected someone eventually. I didn't wait. I turned and climbed fast back toward the ridge. My legs burned, my mouth dry as paper. I moved until the site was out of view and then kept going. Hours later, I had been planning the trip for weeks. Ever since I saw that old post on a hiking forum about an unofficial trail near the South Dakota Badlands, I couldn't get it out of my head. It wasn't marked on any public maps. Someone said it was an old hunting route used in the 80s, long since forgotten. A guy on the forum mentioned a dried-up creek bed that led into a remote stretch of rock and prairie that hardly anyone ever touched. There were no campgrounds, no rangers, no signs. Just miles and miles of jagged rock spires, dusty valleys, and wind-whipped grassland. Sounded perfect. I don't usually hike alone, but I'd done enough solo trips to know how to handle myself. I had all the gear: GPS, printed maps, extra food, a full water bladder, a purification system, and a first aid kit. I told my brother where I was going, even dropped a pin and said if I didn't text by Monday, call someone. I figured I'd be back by Sunday night. It was Friday morning when I set out, the sun just starting to rise over the open land. The first few hours were quiet and peaceful. I parked at a pull-off along the highway, shouldered my pack, and started walking east, following the directions I'd pulled from the forum. I kept my GPS on to track my path and double-checked my position every couple of miles. The land was rough, dry, and broken. The ground crumbled in some places, and I had to watch every step to avoid twisted ankles. There weren't any trees, just endless sun, rock, and sky. The wind never stopped. It blew grit into my eyes and rattled the straps on my pack. By late afternoon, I found the creek bed. It was exactly where they said it would be, dry as bone and maybe 6 feet wide in the center. I followed it for an hour until the banks deepened and the wind got quieter. The sun was going down, so I made camp in a wide pocket in the bank. I didn't bother with a tent. I had my bivy sack and sleeping pad, and the sky was clear. I boiled water for my dehydrated meal and watched the stars come out. There were no lights anywhere, no planes, no sounds except the wind brushing over the rock above. It was beautiful. I slept light, waking a few times in the night to turn over or pull the bag tighter. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard a scuffling sound from above the creek bed, like small rocks shifting. I held still and listened, heart beating a little faster. After a few minutes, nothing else happened. Probably a rabbit or coyote. The next morning, I packed up and kept going. The plan was to follow the creek bed northeast where it eventually met an old fence line, then turn west to loop back toward the highway by Sunday. I wanted to explore the deeper parts of the rock maze on the second day, see what kind of old formations and erosion patterns were out there. It was one of those places where the land just collapsed in on itself. Narrow canyons, sudden drops, hollowed-out cliffs. By noon, I realized I hadn't seen any wildlife all morning. No birds, no bugs, no tracks in the dust. Just dead silence. Even the wind felt softer. There was a stillness that made me uneasy, like the land was holding its breath. I kept walking, checked my GPS, still on the route, but something was off. A little after 1, I spotted something strange along the edge of a low ridge. It looked like a man-made structure, just a glimpse of wood between 2 jagged rocks. I hiked closer and saw it was an old shack, hidden down a narrow side path I almost missed. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The boards were gray and warped, the roof sagging inward. One wall had half collapsed, exposing the inside. There were rusted tools scattered around the doorway and an old, torn canvas tarp nailed to the side. I hesitated. Something about it gave me a bad feeling, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer, climbed the few steps to the broken doorway, and peeked inside. It was small, maybe 10 by 10 feet. Inside, it was darker than I expected. The sunlight barely reached the back wall. There were shelves built into the sides with old jars and cans, some open, some sealed. In the corner was a rusted stove with a chimney pipe that went up through the roof. The floor creaked under my boots. A thick layer of dust covered everything, but it wasn't as thick as it should have been if no one had been inside in years. I noticed some boot prints in the dust. Not deep, but fresh enough. that stopped me cold. I turned and looked behind me, then listened. Nothing. No wind. No footsteps. Just the dead silence pressing in on all sides. I backed out of the shack and walked a wide circle around it, scanning the ground for signs of activity. I found more boot prints around the side, some newer than others. Someone had been coming here, maybe recently. I told myself it could be a hunter or an old local who knew the land, but that didn't explain the feeling I had, that cold, crawling feeling in my gut, like I'd walked into something I wasn't supposed to see. I marked the shack's location on my GPS and kept moving, trying to shake the unease. But as I walked, I kept thinking I heard something behind me, a stone shifting, a whisper of movement in the tall grass. Every time I turned, nothing was there. By mid-afternoon, I was sweating hard. The heat had spiked, and I drunk more water than planned. I stopped to refill at a stagnant pool and filtered carefully, trying not to think about the shack. I kept going until I reached a wide, flat area with several narrow canyons branching off. It was almost like a crossroads. My GPS was acting strange, flickering and slow. The elevation readings kept jumping. That's when I saw the pile of bones. They were bleached white and half buried in dust, scattered near a rock wall like something had dragged them there. I could tell some were deer, but a few were harder to identify. One looked too thick to be an animal leg. It looked human. I didn't want to believe it. I stared for a long time, telling myself I was wrong. Maybe it was an old cow carcass. Maybe erosion had shifted things. But my stomach dropped. I knew what I was looking at. The shape, the length, it was a femur. Person had died out here. My first thought was to take a picture, mark the spot, and report it when I got back. But my second thought was stronger. Get the hell out of there. I turned west and started walking fast, cutting across a section of exposed rock to try to shorten the loop. The terrain got worse, loose gravel, deep gullies, sudden drops that weren't on the map. My GPS froze twice. My compass spun once and then corrected itself. By sundown, I realized I was completely off course. I tried retracing my steps using the sun, but the canyons had twisted me around. Everything looked the same. I climbed a ridge to get my bearings and saw nothing but endless rock and grass in every direction. No sign of the highway, no fences, no power lines. I was deep in the middle of nowhere. I made camp on the ridge, too exhausted to keep going in the dark. I didn't eat much. I kept checking around me, hearing things I couldn't see. Stones falling, faint crunching in the dry brush. At one point, I thought I saw movement down the slope. Something crouched, watching me. But when I shone my light, it was gone. I barely slept. The next morning, I packed up in minutes and started hiking west, using the sun. I didn't care about the route anymore. I just wanted to find the highway or a road or a sign of people. But then I saw the shack again. It was down in a hollow between two rock faces, the exact same shack I'd passed the day before. Same tarp, same broken door, same sagging roof. There was no way I should have ended up back there. I'd gone west. This was east. I'd been hiking in the opposite direction. Panic started to creep in. I checked my GPS again, and it was completely frozen. Just a blinking red dot on a blank screen. No data. My compass needle spun again. Something was wrong with this place. I didn't go near the shack this time. I turned and moved fast, walking until my legs burned. I climbed over a steep hill, slipped twice, scraped my hand, but kept going. I thought I saw tire tracks at one point, but they led nowhere. The ground out there plays tricks on you. Everything feels like it's turning in on itself. By late afternoon, I heard something that made my blood go cold. Footsteps behind me, not animals, not wind. Human steps, steady, deliberate, not trying to hide. I stopped, listened. They stopped too. I walked again. So did they. I broke into a jog, heart pounding, and ducked into a narrow gully, crouching under a ledge. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing came. When I finally looked up, the sun was setting behind the rocks. I didn't move. I stayed there until dark, then used my headlamp to keep going. My water was low. My legs were shaking. That night, I didn't camp. I found a tight space under a rock shelf and hid. I didn't sleep. I kept thinking I heard someone walking nearby, just out of sight. Every few minutes I turned off the light and held my breath, listening. Morning came slow. I was dehydrated and dizzy, but I forced myself to keep going. I had been planning the hike for months. It wasn't some huge bucket list expedition or anything like that. It was just a long weekend away from everything. Away from people, work, the noise of the city. I wanted to be alone in the woods with no cell signal, no emails, and nothing but the sound of wind in the trees. The area I chose was in central Washington, just on the edge of the North Cascades. There was a loop trail that covered about 30 miles over 3 days. Nothing too intense, but far enough from civilization to get some real peace. I drove up early on a Friday morning in late September. The weather was starting to turn, but it wasn't too cold yet. The forecast showed some clouds, but no rain. I parked at a small dirt lot near the trailhead. There were only 2 other vehicles there, an old Subaru and a dusty pickup. I had a good pack with me, well organized, stocked with dehydrated food, a small stove, a tent, sleeping bag, first aid kit, map, compass, and a Garmin GPS unit for backup. I didn't bring a gun, just a bear spray canister. I'd done plenty of solo hikes before and never had any issues. The trail started with a steady incline through dense pine and fir trees. The air smelled sharp with sap and wet dirt. Squirrels darted across the path ahead of me, and every so often I heard birds fluttering above or leaves rustling. The silence out there was different. It wasn't quiet like a library or a room. It was alive, always humming with small movements, creaks, or distant sounds. I liked that. It made me feel like I was part of something older. I made good time the first day. I followed the main loop, climbing higher into thinner air and thicker woods. Around late afternoon, I set up camp near a small alpine lake. There wasn't much flat ground, but I found a soft spot among some trees with a decent windbreak. I cooked, ate, cleaned up, and was in the tent by dusk. It got cold fast once the sun dropped. My sleeping bag kept me warm, and after checking the map one more time, I drifted off to sleep. The next morning was clear and cold. My boots were stiff with dew, and the condensation on my tent froze overnight. I broke camp, refilled my water from a stream using my filter, and got back on the trail by 8 a.m. The second day was longer, about 13 miles with more elevation change. It was slower going, but I stayed on the loop, checking my position with the compass and the map often. At one point, I passed a signpost with an old arrow pointing toward a trail I didn't recognize. Some faded letters, maybe an old Forest Service route. I didn't think much of it. By late afternoon, my legs were shot. I made camp at a rocky outcrop that overlooked a deep ravine. I ate fast, did a quick check of my gear, then crawled into my tent and passed out. It was the third day that everything went wrong. I started out the morning sore but in good spirits. I figured I had around 10 miles left to make it back to the parking lot. My legs hurt, but nothing was injured. I ate breakfast and packed up. The trail was narrow and wound along a ridge. I had to slow down in places, especially where loose rock made the footing sketchy. I kept glancing at the map to stay on track. Around midday, I came to a fork that wasn't marked on my map. There wasn't a sign either, just 2 narrow paths splitting in opposite directions. One looked newer, like it had been used recently. The other was overgrown and disappeared into brush. I wasn't sure which to take. I pulled out the GPS, but the batteries had died. That was my mistake. I should have checked them the night before. I thought about going back the way I came, but that would have added hours, maybe a full extra day. I figured the newer looking trail had to be the right one. It headed roughly in the direction I needed. I started walking. First, the path seemed fine. It descended gradually through tall trees and thick undergrowth. The sun was behind clouds, and the forest got darker. About 2 miles in, the trail narrowed again and started to fade. I kept pushing forward, thinking maybe it would reconnect with the main loop. The farther I went, the less like a trail it looked. I finally admitted I was off trail. There were no blazes, no cut logs, nothing to mark the way. Just deer paths and overgrown brush. I stopped and got out the map. Nothing on it showed this branch. I turned to head back, but I must have taken a slightly different turn than I thought. After 30 minutes of backtracking, I realized I wasn't on the same trail anymore. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The wind had stopped, and the trees around me seemed to press in. I couldn't hear birds anymore. The only sound was the crunch of my boots and the thump of my heartbeat. I tried to stay calm. I told myself I just needed to reorient. I used the compass to take a bearing and started heading west, hoping to intersect the main trail. I climbed a low ridge to get a better view, but the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. No peaks, no clearings, no signs of the trail, just green and gray. Around late afternoon, I found a small dry creek bed and followed it downhill, thinking it would lead to a stream and maybe a lower trail. But the terrain got rough. The sides of the ravine were steep, and I had to grab roots and rocks to keep from sliding. My boots slipped constantly on the loose soil. After an hour, I fell hard, landing on my side and jamming my shoulder. The pain was sharp and deep. I sat there for a while, breathing hard, trying not to panic. I moved my arm. It wasn't broken, but it felt strained, maybe pulled. I couldn't lift it fully. I knew I wouldn't make it out before nightfall. I found a flat spot beside a boulder and set up camp. I had enough food and water for a couple more days. I thought about using the emergency beacon on my Garmin, but it wasn't working without batteries. I cursed myself for not packing a backup set. That night was the longest I can remember. I heard noises outside the tent, something moving through the brush, slow and deliberate. Not a deer, too quiet, too steady. I held my breath and clutched the bear spray. The sounds stopped eventually, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, I started walking again. My shoulder ached with every step. I ate little, trying to conserve food. I followed the creek bed farther down. By noon, I saw something that made my heart leap. A tire track, half buried in mud. I followed it. It wasn't a road, just a faint path where maybe an ATV had gone. It curved and twisted through the woods, leading me deeper but giving me hope. By early evening, I saw the remains of an old structure, just rotting beams and a collapsed roof. Maybe an old ranger shack or hunting cabin. I approached carefully. The place was abandoned, no roof, just partial walls, and the stench of rot and mildew. But inside, I found what looked like the remains of a fire pit, rusted cans, and a half-broken metal chair. I spent the night there. I didn't even bother with the tent. I huddled near the ruined fire pit and ate a cold meal. I thought about my family, about how stupid it was not to tell anyone exactly which route I was taking. I had no signal, no way to call out. The next morning, I found a dirt path leading away from the shack. It was narrow, overgrown, but clearly man-made. I followed it. Hours passed. The forest changed around me. Trees got thinner, more sunlight broke through. Eventually, I saw something that almost made me cry. A trail marker, old and cracked, but it matched one from the map. I had made it back to the loop. I was at least 8 miles from the trailhead, but I was back. I didn't stop to rest. I walked fast, even though every part of me hurt. By sundown, I reached the lot. My car was there. The Subaru and the pickup were gone. When I got inside my car, I didn't even take off my pack. I drove straight out, stopping at the first gas station with cell service to call my brother and tell him I was okay. I don't think I ever truly understood fear until that trip. It wasn't just the physical danger. It was the silence, the disorientation, the way the forest swallowed everything, the feeling that no one knew where I was, that no one was coming. I still hike now, but I don't do it solo anymore. I pack backup batteries. I leave a detailed plan with someone I trust. I follow the marked trails, no exceptions. Getting lost wasn't what scared me most. It was realizing how easy it was to disappear out there, how no one would even know where to look. That detour almost killed me. It didn't feel like a big decision at the time, just one step off the main trail, one wrong turn, but it was enough to bring me to the edge. And I was lucky, because not everyone who gets lost in the woods makes it back. had been planning the hike for a while. It was late September, and I wanted to squeeze in one more trip before the weather got too cold. I had my eyes on the Wind River Range in Wyoming. It was quieter than Yellowstone, not too crowded, and had hundreds of miles of trails through wild, open country. I spent a week preparing. I packed dehydrated meals, a small stove, extra layers, a tent, water filter, first aid kit, bear spray, GPS, a backup compass and map, and my satellite communicator. I checked the weather, loaded maps onto my phone, and left my itinerary with a friend. I parked at the big sandy trailhead early in the morning. The lot had maybe 5 cars. The air was cold, still, and crisp. I signed the register at the trailhead box and started off just as the sun rose over the mountains. My plan was to hike out about 10 miles, camp for the night near a small lake I saw on the map, and explore a bit off-trail the next day before heading back. The trail was quiet and peaceful. I passed through dense pine forest, wide meadows dotted with fading wildflowers, and rocky sections that climbed gradually into higher elevations. A few hours in, I hadn't seen a single person. There was no cell service, which I expected. The GPS still tracked my route, and I checked the map often. I liked knowing exactly where I was. I stopped around noon to eat a protein bar and drink some water near a stream. The only sound was the water and wind in the trees. By late afternoon, I reached the lake. It was small and quiet, with a few boulders scattered around and a soft clearing under some trees. I set up camp, filtered water, and cooked a hot meal. The sun went down fast behind the ridgeline. I crawled into my tent and read for a while before falling asleep. Around 3 a.m., I woke up needing to pee. I didn't want to go far. I unzipped the tent and stepped out. It was freezing. I went a few steps into the trees, did what I had to do, and turned back. That's when I noticed something strange. There was a small flicker of light deeper in the woods. At first, I thought it was moonlight catching on water or maybe a reflection from my own headlamp, but I had turned it off. I stood still and looked again. The flicker came and went. I crouched, trying to make sense of it. It was a faint orange glow, maybe 100 yards away. My brain ran through explanations. Maybe another camper, though I hadn't seen anyone all day. Could it be lightning? A fire? I stared at it for a minute. It looked like a small flame, but it was low to the ground and didn't move like a campfire. I didn't go toward it. I got back into the tent and zipped everything shut. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept thinking I heard footsteps, but every time I held my breath to listen, it went quiet again. I told myself it was animals, maybe elk, maybe nothing. The next morning, I packed up quickly. I didn't want to camp another night in that exact spot. I decided I'd go explore the off-trail area I had picked out on the map, about 2 miles east, but I'd make sure to loop back toward the trailhead to stay closer to my exit point. As I hiked east, the terrain got rougher. The trail disappeared, and I moved through patches of thick trees and steep granite slopes. I used the map and GPS often. After an hour, I saw something that stopped me cold. There was a tent. It was off to the side, maybe 60 feet from the edge of a rocky slope. Not visible unless you were really looking. It was old, dark green nylon, sagging in the middle, coated in dirt and leaves. No signs of recent use. No fire pit, no gear, no visible tracks. Just a tent alone in the woods. I slowly walked closer. The zipper was half open. I called out, then immediately remembered I was supposed to be alone out here and shut up. I walked around the side. It looked like it had been there a long time. No smell of decay, but definitely not fresh. Inside, I saw an old foam sleeping pad, an empty backpack, a torn jacket, and a couple of empty water bottles. No food, no ID, no name, no boots. Creeped me out. Not in a horror movie way, just in a deeply unsettling way. Someone had camped out here, but it didn't look like they had hiked out. I backed away and left it untouched. I marked the location on my GPS and decided I was done exploring. I started heading west, trying to connect back to the main trail as fast as possible. I checked my watch. It was around 1 p.m. I figured I could hike most of the way out and camp closer to the car. I kept checking over my shoulder. I didn't see anyone. No noise, just the wind. I walked fast, trying not to trip on rocks or roots. After a while, I noticed something weird. My GPS showed me going in circles. I was sure I had been heading west. I had checked my compass. But now I was back near a ridge I had passed an hour earlier. I took out the paper map. It didn't match what the GPS was telling me. Something was off. I stopped walking. I took a breath. I forced myself to sit and eat. I drank water and stared at the map for 20 minutes. Finally, I realized I had made a huge error. When I had left the tent, I hadn't reoriented properly. I had walked in the wrong direction for almost an hour and looped myself right back toward the off-trail area. Panic started to rise in my chest. It was about 3:30 p.m., and I was still way off the main trail. I wasn't lost exactly. I had GPS and a map, but I was far from where I thought I'd be by now. And something about that tent kept gnawing at me. I picked a new bearing. I marked the main trail and the trailhead on the GPS and started moving in a straight line toward it, slowly and carefully. The sun was dropping fast again, and the shadows between the trees got long and dark. About 40 minutes later, I heard a sound. It was behind me, leaves crunching, a soft, steady pace. I froze. I didn't turn around right away. I just crouched slowly, heart pounding. The sound stopped. I finally turned and scanned the trees. Nothing. I waited. I held the bear spray tightly. Nothing moved. I turned and kept going. Faster now, heart racing. I didn't hear the noise again, but I kept thinking about that tent. Why was it so far off trail? Why was it left behind like that? Where was the person who used it? I made it back to the trail just before sunset. The relief hit me hard, but I didn't stop. I hiked another hour, putting as much distance between me and that area as I could. I camped in a flat spot near a small stream. I barely ate. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I started hiking before the sun was fully up. I didn't stop for anything except water. I reached the trailhead by noon. My car was fine. Nothing out of place. I signed out in the register and drove straight into the nearest town. At a small ranger station, I reported what I found. The tent, the exact GPS location, what it looked like. The ranger didn't seem shocked. He told me they find old camps sometimes. Some abandoned, some connected to missing persons cases, some just left behind. I asked if I should have done more. He shook his head. I could tell he had seen worse. A few weeks later, I got an email from someone in the Forest Service. They'd hiked out and found the tent. No body, no evidence of foul play, just gear that matched a person who had been reported missing 2 years earlier. They said it wasn't suspicious, just sad. That stuck with me. It was a real person, not a ghost or anything like that. Just someone who went into the woods and never made it out. Maybe they got hurt. Maybe they got lost. Maybe they just couldn't bring themselves to leave. But they had been there, alone, probably scared. And nobody found them until I passed by, completely by accident. I still hike. I still camp alone sometimes. But I carry more backups now, extra maps, extra lights, extra batteries. I leave even more detailed itineraries. I stick to marked trails more than I used to, and I never forget how easy it is to go just a little too far in the wrong direction and vanish into the trees. I left my car just after sunrise on a Friday morning. The parking area at the base of the mountain was empty except for one dusty pickup truck that looked like it had been sitting there for days. I tightened the straps of my pack, double-checked my laces, and stepped onto the narrow trail that led into the forest. It was going to be a solo weekend hike. I'd been planning it for months, and this time, I was going further than I ever had before. The trail started off easy. The ground was dry, scattered with pine needles and the occasional root. The air was cool and smelled like wet bark and moss. Birds chirped high in the trees, and I could hear the faint sound of a creek running off to my right somewhere beyond the trees. I kept a good pace and felt strong. My plan was to hike about 17 miles in and set up camp at a lake that barely anyone knew about. I'd found it while studying old topo maps online. It was off-trail, but reachable with a bit of bushwhacking and some patience. The hours passed quietly. Around midday, I stopped at a bend in the trail to eat a protein bar and drink some water. I hadn't seen a single person since I left the trailhead. That was part of why I did these trips. No phone signal, no voices, just trees, dirt, and time to think. After my short break, I continued on. I passed a couple of trail markers, faded and crooked, with numbers carved into them. I checked my paper map and compass, making sure I was on course. Around mile 12, I reached the fork I'd marked on my map. The main trail bent left and began climbing steeply up toward a ridgeline. The trail I planned to take wasn't marked. It was an old fire road, barely visible anymore, but it would take me closer to the lake. From there, I'd bushwhack the last 3 miles. The fire road was overgrown and soft underfoot, but walkable. It wound through denser woods, and the light dimmed as the canopy above thickened. I pushed forward, checking my location every few minutes. The ground was flatter here, but the brush was thicker. Occasionally, I had to step over fallen branches or slow down where the trail was completely covered. It was around 4 p.m. when I came across the first strange thing. I was stepping over a low log when I noticed something off to the side of the trail. A small pile of rocks. It wasn't unnatural by itself. Sometimes people leave cairns or markers, but this one didn't look right. It was too neat, too deliberate. 6 smooth stones, all stacked vertically in a perfect column, with a bit of string wrapped around the top one like a bow. There were no signs of recent hiking traffic out here. No footprints, no other markers. I stared at it for a minute, feeling something tight in my stomach, then turned and kept walking. I didn't touch it. I didn't even want to get close. By 6 p.m., I'd reached the area where the trail disappeared. From here, I needed to cut north through the woods and find the lake. I had 3 hours of daylight left, more than enough if I kept moving. I pulled out my compass again, oriented myself, and began the off-trail stretch. The trees were closer together here. Dead branches scratched at my arms. The undergrowth was thicker. The air smelled different, less clean, more like wet rot and old leaves. I stepped carefully, listening for water, watching for any signs of animal paths. At one point, I passed through a patch of fern so thick I couldn't see the ground. I nearly twisted my ankle on a hidden root. After that, I slowed down. I didn't want to get hurt out here. Another hour passed. I was sweating heavily, even though the air was getting cooler. The sun had dropped behind the trees, and the shadows were long and heavy. I still hadn't found the lake. I knew I should have seen it by now. I kept checking my compass, kept adjusting my course slightly north. Something didn't feel right. The land was flatter than it should have been. I should have started descending by now toward the lake basin. I stopped and looked around. Nothing but trees. The same kind I'd been walking through for hours. I pulled out my topo map again and double-checked my location, but the details didn't help. Everything around me looked the same. I tried to stay calm. I sat down on a rock, took off my pack, and drank some water. I had plenty of supplies. I had shelter. I could camp right where I was if I needed to, but I hated the idea of being off track. I hated not knowing exactly where I was. Then I noticed the second strange thing. About 20 yards behind me, barely visible through the trees, was another pile of rocks. Another stack, almost identical to the first one I'd seen hours earlier on the fire road. Smooth stones, same size, same shape, same bit of string tied around the top. I hadn't passed it. I'd been walking in the opposite direction. I stared at it for a long time. My skin crawled. I suddenly felt the urge to move. Fast. I grabbed my pack and headed northeast. I needed to find open ground, a landmark, anything to orient myself. The light was fading fast, and I didn't want to get stuck in thick brush after dark. My legs were getting tired, but I pushed them harder. My arms were scratched and stinging. Sweat dripped into my eyes. After 30 more minutes of pushing through dense forest, I broke into a clearing. It was a wide patch of bare dirt surrounded by trees. The grass was dead. The ground was uneven, like something had been dug up and left to settle. In the center of the clearing, half buried in dirt, was a long wooden beam. It looked like part of a cabin wall, old, splintered, rotted out on one end. Not natural. Someone had built something here, and it had been gone a long time. I circled the beam slowly. Behind it was what looked like the remains of a foundation, just a few stones arranged in a rectangle. Beyond that, nothing but more trees. I checked my compass again. It didn't make sense. North had shifted by several degrees. I turned it slowly in my hand. The needle moved. It wasn't holding steady. I pulled out my backup compass, the smaller one I kept in my first aid kit. Same thing. Both were swinging wildly, refusing to lock onto north. That's when I started feeling the first deep fear. I knew that wasn't normal. I was either surrounded by something magnetic, like old iron or a natural deposit, or something was interfering. But there was no metal out here. No old mines. No towers. Just dirt and trees. I marked the location on my map anyway, took a few photos with my phone even though I had no signal, and moved on. I figured I'd hike until I couldn't see anymore, then make camp. I found a relatively flat area under a big pine tree and set up my tent. I didn't build a fire. I didn't feel like drawing attention. I just sat in the tent, headlamp on, eating cold food out of a bag. My legs were sore. My hands were shaking slightly. I kept hearing noises outside, branches cracking, the rustle of leaves, but I tried to tell myself it was just normal forest sounds. Rabbits, wind, maybe a deer. I didn't sleep well. I woke up several times, heart pounding, convinced I'd heard footsteps just outside the tent. But when I peeked through the mesh, I saw nothing, just black trees and pale moonlight. At first light, I packed up and started walking. I didn't bother looking for the lake anymore. I just wanted to find the fire road again. If I could get back to the trail, I could head out. But everything looked different in the morning. The trees weren't familiar. The slope of the land had changed. I tried to retrace my steps toward the old foundation, but I couldn't find the clearing again. It was gone, like I dreamed it. I hiked for hours. My legs were growing weaker. I rationed water. My compass still didn't work. I climbed a small ridge hoping for a view, but the trees went on forever in every direction. Just forest. No lakes, no mountains, no signs of human life. Then I saw the third thing. I was coming down the far side of the ridge when I noticed something dark at the base of a tree. It was a backpack, weathered, torn in places, half buried in leaves. I approached slowly. It looked like it had been out there for years. Inside, I found a rusted multi-tool, a crushed metal water bottle, and a moldy trail map folded into a Ziploc bag. I pulled out the map and unfolded it. It was the same trail system I was on. Same names, same contour lines, but the ink was faded, and in the margin was a note, scrawled in shaky handwriting. If you find this, go south. Always south. No name, no date. I dropped the map and backed away. My skin felt cold. I took a deep breath and turned. I decided to follow the note's advice. I turned myself directly south using the sun and began walking. I didn't care where it led. I just needed out. I walked for hours. No trail, no break in the trees. The ground dipped and rose over and over, and I started stumbling more often. My legs were rubber. My water was almost gone. Then, just as the sun dipped low again, I saw a line in the dirt. Straight, man-made, a trail. I nearly cried. It was narrow and rough, but it had clearly been cut by people. I followed it, limping now, exhausted. After another hour of I'd been planning the trip for over a month. The idea was simple. Spend 4 days alone on a long hiking loop that cut through a section of remote wilderness in the northern part of the state. It wasn't anything too crazy or dangerous on paper, just under 50 miles total, spread out across 4 days. I wanted time to be alone, away from everything. Work had been getting to me, and I needed space to clear my head. I chose this specific trail because it was supposed to be quiet, not totally unused, but rarely crowded. I didn't want popular, scenic overlooks full of people taking photos. I wanted long stretches of quiet woods, challenging terrain, and the feeling of isolation. I wanted to earn the solitude. I parked my car at the small gravel lot just after sunrise. It was early fall, cool and damp. The trailhead didn't even have a real sign. Just a small wooden post with a faded blaze and a plastic box holding folded maps. I took one out, checked the route one more time, and tucked it in my pack. I already had the trail downloaded on my phone and GPS watch, but I liked paper as a backup. That's what I had learned from other hikes. Assume something will go wrong. The first day was smooth. I moved at a steady pace, crossed 2 ridgelines, and made it down into a wide valley just as the light started changing. The forest was thick but not oppressive. It had that quiet sound, just birds, wind, the occasional rustle of leaves. I passed one guy around mid-morning, heading the opposite direction. We nodded, and that was it. I didn't see anyone else for the rest of the day. I made camp in a clearing just off a bend in the trail where it ran alongside a shallow stream. The water was cold and clean, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. I pitched my small tent, made a quick dinner, and spent the evening staring at the fire until it burned down to coals. I slept well that night, and in the morning, I felt like I was doing exactly what I needed to be doing. Day 2 started out great. I moved fast and made good distance early. Around mid-morning, the trail began to climb. It wound up the side of a steep hill, switching back and forth, loose rock crunching under my boots with every step. The trees grew thinner as I climbed. I stopped at the top for a break and looked out over the vast stretch of forest behind me. It was just endless green, fading into blue mountains far in the distance. It looked like it went on forever. I kept going, back into thicker woods, where the light dimmed and everything felt still. That's when the trail started getting less obvious. The blazes were more faded here. Sometimes I had to double back just to find the next one. But I wasn't worried. I still had the GPS and it was tracking fine. It wasn't until early evening that I realized I'd gone off the main trail somehow. I was moving fast and must have followed an old logging path or game trail without realizing it. It was faint, but it looked worn enough that I didn't question it at first. By the time I noticed there were no blazes or signs, I was already a good ways down a hill. I checked the GPS and saw I had veered maybe half a mile from the main route. Not a huge deal. Rather than backtrack, I decided to cut across and rejoin the trail. The map showed that the main loop curved back near a ridgeline just northeast of where I was. If I kept a steady heading, I could hit the trail again in an hour or two. That's when everything started to go wrong. The terrain didn't match the topo lines as closely as I expected. What looked like a gradual slope on the map was steep and uneven in person. I had to scramble over fallen logs and through thick underbrush, and progress slowed to a crawl. My legs got scratched up from brambles. I fell once, nothing serious, but it jarred me and made me more cautious. The GPS lost signal briefly under the dense canopy. Came back. But when it did, the track it showed didn't line up with where I thought I was. I figured it had just glitched. I tried not to panic. I took a short break, drank some water, and recalculated the direction I needed to go. I still had hours of daylight, but then the forest got strange. Not in a supernatural way, just different. The trees here were older, darker. The ground felt softer, like it had been wet longer. I started seeing things that made me nervous. Animal bones, small at first, then larger. A deer skull half buried in leaves. A strange lean-to made of branches tied together with some kind of wire. Rusted old metal tools jammed into a tree trunk. I told myself it was probably from old hunters or maybe someone squatting out here years ago. Still, it unsettled me. There were no boot prints, no trash, no signs of human activity otherwise. Around dusk, I stopped. I hadn't found the trail again. I hadn't seen a single blaze in hours. I pitched camp in a flat spot under some trees and tried to act like everything was fine. But I barely ate. I kept thinking I'd hear someone, or something, moving through the trees. There was no wind that night, but I kept hearing creaks and thuds in the distance. Not animals, not wind, just heavy, irregular thumps, spaced apart, like someone walking slow. I didn't sleep much. I had my knife in my hand for most of the night. I kept imagining someone was watching the tent from the trees. But morning came and nothing had happened. I packed up at first light and moved fast. My legs were sore, and I was more tired than I expected. I turned the GPS back on, but the signal was bouncing, weak. I used my compass and tried to head north-northeast to intercept the trail again. I came across an old fire pit late that morning. Not a campsite, just a ring of scorched stones, blackened ground, and some old burned sticks. Nearby, there were scraps of faded cloth and what looked like a child's shoe.
Torn, molde.
I didn't stop long. It didn't feel right. By midday, I was low on water and hadn't found a stream. I rationed what I had left. I started marking trees with my knife so I wouldn't double back. The forest began to look the same in every direction. I started to question everything, my direction, my sense of time. I began checking the compass every few minutes, convinced I was spinning in circles. But it always pointed the same way. That's when I noticed the traps. First, it was just a coil of rusted wire hanging from a tree. Then I found a small snare on the ground, old but still set. Then another, and another. Some were clearly made for small animals, but others were larger. I nearly stepped in one. A jagged, open steel jaw hidden under a bed of moss. These weren't just remnants. Someone had been maintaining them. Not recently maybe, but not decades ago either. The steel was rusted, but not falling apart. I realized I might be in someone's territory. Someone who didn't want people around. I slowed down. I stopped using the GPS and moved only by compass and the map now. I didn't want to risk drawing attention if someone was watching. Late that afternoon, I found what I thought was a trail again. It was narrow, faint, but it looked man-made. It curved up through the woods in the right direction. I followed it, hoping it would lead to the main loop. Instead, it led to a cabin. I didn't expect that. It was small, tucked into the side of a hill, built low and wide with dark, rotting wood and a rusted metal roof. There were no windows. The door was closed, but there were boot prints in the mud around the steps. Old maybe, but not ancient. I didn't go near it. I backed away slowly and circled around it, keeping my distance. I didn't want to know who lived there, or if they were watching. I moved uphill fast, out of sight, and didn't stop until I'd gone a full mile. I camped cold that night, no fire, no cooking, just dry food and silence. I hung my pack high in a tree and slept with my knife again, but I didn't sleep much. The sound came back, that same steady thump, closer this time. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe hard. Passed eventually, but I never heard it go far. When the sun came up, I started hiking again. I was exhausted, out of water, and anxious. I had cuts on my legs and arms. I smelled like fear and dirt. I followed the compass and map, refusing to turn on the GPS anymore. I wanted out. I didn't care about finishing the loop. I just wanted to hit a road or a known trailhead. Midday, I stumbled onto a hunter's blind, an old wooden platform high in a tree, covered in camo netting. I climbed it, hoping to see something from above. That's when I saw the logging road. It cut through the forest maybe half a mile north. Faint, overgrown, but definitely man-made and definitely real. I climbed down, ran most of the way there, and hit the gravel with relief I didn't know I could feel. I followed the road for hours. Late that afternoon, I saw the first sign of other people. A pile of fresh-cut logs, marked with spray paint, then tire tracks, then the faint sound of machinery. Eventually, I reached a work crew, guys in orange vests cutting trees. They stared when I came stumbling out of the woods like a ghost. I must have looked like hell, muddy, scratched, wild-eyed. They helped me, gave me water, called someone. I didn't tell them everything, just said I got lost, went off trail. I had been hiking for years, not professionally or anything, just a regular guy who liked getting away from city noise, screens, and the dull rhythm of every day. My hikes weren't about posting photos or racing against time. They were just about walking, sweating, breathing, and being somewhere I wasn't normally supposed to be. In early September, I took time off work and planned a solo 3-day hike in the remote parts of the Bitterroot Mountains in Montana. I had studied topographic maps and read trip reports for weeks. I wasn't aiming for the typical trails. I wanted something more isolated, a little harder, but not dangerous, just enough to make me feel like I earned every step. I planned to start near Painted Rocks Reservoir, hike through West Fork, follow a narrow, rarely used ridge to a set of unnamed alpine lakes tucked high near the Idaho border, and loop back by descending through a deep forested valley that paralleled the ridge from the other side. That ridge was the challenge. It wasn't on any of the major trail apps. The Forest Service map showed a faint dotted line from the 1980s, barely a trail anymore. But satellite views confirmed there were clearings, old fire cuts, and some kind of path up there, even if it was grown over. I parked my car at a turnout near the West Fork trailhead at sunrise. It was quiet and cold, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're somewhere important. I threw on my pack, tightened my boots, and started off into the trees. The first day was perfect. The main trail climbed gradually along the creek, weaving through towering pines and firs, the ground soft with decades of fallen needles. I made good time, stopping only to filter water and eat something quick. I camped just below tree line that night, beside a small meadow where the air smelled like crushed sage and pine sap. I didn't see another soul. The second day, I left the main trail and started climbing toward the ridge. There was no sign marking the junction, just a subtle break in the brush where I guessed others had once passed. I had to fight through low shrubs at first, then the terrain got steeper and the trees thinner. The wind picked up as I climbed, and by midday, I was above the tree line, following a path that was more animal trail than anything man-made. From the top of the ridge, the view was insane. Layers of green and gray mountains stacked like ocean waves, with bright blue lakes glinting way down in the valleys. I took a long break there, eating a cold tortilla with peanut butter, watching the clouds drift low across the peaks. That ridge was harder than I thought. The rocks were loose in some spots, and steep sections forced me to use my hands to climb. Several times, the path just vanished, and I had to rely on the GPS on my watch and my printed map. I never got lost, but I kept checking. There were no signs of recent human travel, no boot prints, no wrappers, no fire rings. Just scat, claw marks on trees, and a dead deer skeleton bleached white near a cliff edge. By late afternoon, I had covered maybe 10 miles along the ridge. My legs were exhausted from the constant up and down. I found a narrow, flat spot among some scrubby trees that somehow clung to the exposed rock and set up camp. I made instant rice and jerky and watched the sun drop behind the peaks to the west. The wind howled all night, and I barely slept. The third morning, everything started fine. My goal was to finish the ridge by midday, then descend into the forested valley on the other side, which would take me back to the main trail by evening. The weather looked good. My knees hurt, but I was used to that. 2 hours after breaking camp, I hit a section of the ridge that didn't match my map. It wasn't just different, it was wrong. The line I had been following bent sharply south, away from where the descent trail was supposed to begin. I stopped and pulled out the map, then double-checked with my GPS. Both said I should be heading west, but the ridge itself had collapsed in that direction. There had clearly been a rock slide or a fire long ago that wiped out the trail. What remained was a steep drop of scree and unstable soil, almost vertical. There was no way to safely go that way. I backtracked a few hundred yards, thinking maybe I missed a fork or a side trail. Nothing. I scrambled down a side slope looking for an easier descent route. Still nothing. Everything dropped off in sharp cliffs or steep talus fields too dangerous to cross without ropes. My only options were to turn around and go back the entire ridge, or try to bushwhack down the unmarked side. The problem with turning around was time. If I backtracked, I'd run out of water before reaching the nearest creek, and my legs were already done. I decided to cut down the east slope, hoping to intersect the valley trail lower down. It was a bad idea. The descent started okay, tight switchbacks between boulders and patches of scrub. But then it got steeper and looser. My boots slid out more than once, and I had to lower myself down ledges using tree trunks and exposed roots. I checked my GPS constantly. It showed a straight line between me and the valley floor, less than a mile, but it wasn't flat. It was a maze of gullies, fallen trees, and rocky outcrops. 3 hours later, I was still trying to get down. I slipped and fell hard when the soil gave out beneath a patch of moss. My left thigh hit a sharp rock, tearing my pants and slicing deep into the muscle. Blood soaked through fast. I tied it tight with a bandana and limped forward, hoping I was close. I wasn't. There were no trails. The forest was denser than I expected. Every step was a fight, ducking under branches, climbing over rotting logs, slipping on loose pine needles. Flies buzzed thick around my head. I stopped to drink and noticed my water was almost gone. I hadn't crossed a stream in hours. It was past midday when I realized I was in real trouble. I was too far down to get back up to the ridge, and the slope was too steep to descend much further safely. The injury on my leg throbbed constantly. The cut had clotted, but it was red and swollen. I started to feel a little dizzy. I needed to find water and shelter fast. I pushed downhill for another hour until I heard the faint sound of trickling water. It was coming from a narrow ravine choked with undergrowth. I followed the sound and finally found a tiny stream running over rocks, barely wider than a gutter. I filled my bottle and drank deeply, then filled it again. I decided to stay nearby for the night. My leg was getting worse, and I was worried about infection. I set up a crude camp near a fallen tree and used the tarp from my pack to cover myself. I chewed on some trail mix and jerky, but I had no appetite. The forest felt different now, too quiet. I had never felt scared in the woods before, but that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I woke up soaked in sweat. My leg burned, and my head throbbed. I was feverish. My first thought was sepsis. I had no antibiotics, and I was miles from help. I needed to get out. The next morning, I checked my GPS again. The signal was weak, but it placed me less than 2 miles from the forest road that paralleled the trail. It would be hard to reach, but it was the only chance I had. I marked the direction and started moving. Every step was harder than the last. My leg dragged behind me like dead weight. I used a stick as a crutch, swinging it forward with each limp. The forest was still thick, but the slope began to level out slightly. I followed the sound of birds, figuring they usually stayed near open areas. Hours passed. My water ran low again. My energy was gone. I dropped to the ground several times, staring up at the trees, thinking maybe I wouldn't make it. But each time, I forced myself to stand back up and keep going. Eventually, I heard something unnatural, something that didn't belong in the forest. A mechanical hum, then a distant crunch of tires over gravel. I pushed toward the sound with everything I had left. My hands tore open on thorns. My knee gave out twice, but I kept moving. And then, just past a thick grove of aspens, I saw the road. It looked like a miracle, just a strip of gravel with faded tire tracks. But it was the most beautiful thing I had seen in my life. I stumbled out into the open and collapsed. I laid there for maybe 10 minutes before I forced myself to crawl closer to the edge, where I might be seen. I waited for what felt like hours. Then I heard an engine. A dusty pickup truck came around the bend. The driver slowed, stopped, and jumped out. He looked shocked to see me, dirty, bloodied, half-conscious, but he helped me up and got me into the truck. He drove me straight to the nearest ranger station, and from there, they called for emergency medical help. I passed out before they put me in the ambulance. The next time I woke up, I was in a hospital bed with an 4 in my arm and clean sheets under me. They told me the cut on my leg had gotten badly infected, and I had been dehydrated and hypothermic when I was found. A few more hours out there, they said, and I probably wouldn't have made it. Took me weeks to fully recover. My leg still bears a long scar, and I walk with a slight limp. But I'm alive. I never went back to that ridge. I never even looked at the maps again. I still hike, but I stick to trails now. I carry a satellite communicator, and I check in constantly. That trip The sun had barely risen when I decided to head out. It wasn't that I was in a rush or needed to escape, but something about being alone in nature called to me. I've been itching for a good hike for a while. It's one of those things that always sounds like a good idea when you're sitting at home, especially after a stressful week. I live in a small town near a few wooded areas, so when I was planning my hike, I didn't need to drive far. I knew the area well. It wasn't exactly popular, but it wasn't unheard of either. A trail that seemed harmless enough, winding through thick trees and rocky terrain, eventually opening up to a small creek. Peaceful, quiet, just how I liked it. I packed the basics: water, some granola bars, a map, and a small first aid kit. Nothing fancy. I set out early, knowing that the longer I waited, the more crowded the trail might get. There's something about the early morning that feels like a secret, like nature hasn't fully woken up, and you get to see it in its most raw, untouched form. The cool morning air felt refreshing against my skin as I made my way through the underbrush, the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt beneath me. First, the trail was easy. The path was wide and well-trodden, and the trees shaded me from the harsh rays of the sun. I lost track of time, only checking my watch every now and then, realizing the hours passed quicker than I expected. The further I went, the more I noticed the air growing heavier, thicker. The trees closed in tighter around me, and the sounds of the outside world seemed to fade away. It was almost too quiet. I wasn't the type to get spooked easily, but I couldn't deny that I felt something off. Maybe it was the silence, or maybe the way the trail seemed to narrow, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I shrugged it off, of course. Nature has a way of making you feel small, insignificant, like you're not alone even when you are. I pulled out my water bottle and took a sip, pausing to look around. The sun was still high, but the trees above me were thick enough to keep the forest floor shaded, giving everything a dim, almost surreal quality. The path was gradually becoming more challenging. The ground was uneven, and rocks jutted out at odd angles. It wasn't dangerous, but it was enough to make me slow down. I'd have to be more careful from here on out. But what struck me most was how eerily quiet it had become. It was just me, the trail, and the distant rustling of leaves. I continued to move forward, taking slow but steady steps. The further I went, the fewer signs of other hikers I saw. There were no trail markers anymore, no evidence that anyone had passed through recently. It was as if I was the only one who had walked this path in days, maybe longer. I paused again, this time at a small clearing, taking in the view. It wasn't much, just a patch of grass surrounded by trees, with a thin trickle of water running through the rocks. But something about it felt different, like something had happened here, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I shook the feeling off and sat on a nearby rock. The solitude was supposed to be calming, but now, with the isolation starting to sink in, I wasn't sure I liked how quiet it had become. I knew I needed to keep moving, to push through the weirdness I was feeling. I packed up my things and stood up, continuing along the trail. It was only then that I noticed something strange, small, faded markings on a tree. I stepped closer to get a better look. They were carvings, old ones. The markings looked like someone had scratched symbols into the bark, though it was hard to make out exactly what they meant. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't recall seeing these symbols in any guidebook or hearing anything about them in my research on the trail. They were out of place, almost deliberately hidden. I stood there for a moment, uneasy, trying to piece together what this could mean. But no answers came. I took a deep breath and turned away. It was probably nothing, just some random carvings. But something inside me urged me to be cautious. I kept my pace steady, eyes darting to the side every now and then, half expecting to see something that wasn't there. The woods had that effect on me, and then suddenly it happened. I heard a sound. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was so quiet that at first I thought I'd imagined it. But there it was again, a faint rustling, like footsteps brushing through the leaves. My pulse quickened. I stopped in my tracks, listening. The sound was subtle, rhythmic, like someone else was walking just off the trail, staying just far enough out of sight. But I hadn't seen anyone for miles. I squinted into the woods, trying to see through the trees. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Was someone else on the trail? Or had I stumbled upon something else? I decided to keep moving, though now I was much more alert. The rustling sound followed me for a while, always just beyond the trees, never close enough to reveal anything. It was starting to make me paranoid. As I pushed deeper into the forest, the trail began to get steeper. My legs burned with each step, but I kept climbing. There were no signs of anyone else around. No hikers, no animals, just the sound of the wind and the occasional bird call. I reached a small plateau, and that's when I saw it. A set of footprints, deep in the mud, leading off the trail and into the brush. They were fresh, no more than a day old. I crouched down to get a better look. The prints were large, bigger than mine, and there was something about the way they were spaced that made my stomach twist. Whoever had made these prints wasn't walking naturally. They were moving with a purpose, stepping with intent. The marks seemed deliberate, almost as though someone was trying to hide their tracks. I stood up, feeling the weight of the situation settling in. Something wasn't right. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I didn't. I kept walking. The trail narrowed further. The trees grew closer together, their branches twisting above me like the gnarled fingers of some ancient hand. The footprints I had found were still fresh, and now I was sure there was someone out here and they were following me. My breathing quickened, and my pace increased, though I tried to stay calm. I was not about to be intimidated by whatever or whoever was out there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked over my shoulder, the woods seemed darker, deeper. Then I saw it. Just off the trail, barely visible through the thicket, was something strange, something that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just another tree or rock, but as I got closer, I realized it was a structure, partially hidden by the undergrowth. It looked like a makeshift shelter. Someone had built it out of branches, leaves, and other debris. It wasn't large, but it was enough to make me stop dead in my tracks. My heart pounded in my chest as I took in the sight. The structure looked old, abandoned, but also oddly new at the same time, like it had been recently disturbed. I stepped closer, compelled by a mix of curiosity and dread. The shelter's walls were made of long, weathered branches, and a few rusty nails peeked through the cracks. I reached out, hesitated, then gently pushed aside some of the branches. Inside, there was a blanket, a couple of empty cans, and something that made my blood run cold. A half-burnt candle. It wasn't a shelter made by some harmless hiker. It was a hideout. I turned to leave, the panic beginning to rise in my chest. The forest suddenly felt much more threatening. But just as I started to retreat, a loud crack broke the silence. A twig snapped behind me. I froze. I didn't wait to see who or what was behind me. My legs moved faster than I thought possible, the panic setting in full force. I ran back down the trail, not daring to look behind me, but knowing somehow that something was chasing me. I had always enjoyed hiking. There was something about being out in nature that made me feel free, unburdened by the noise of the world. The wind in the trees, the crunch of gravel underfoot, the distant sounds of animals. It all gave me a kind of peace that nothing else did. I wasn't particularly experienced, but I had done enough hikes to know my limits. I had gear, nothing fancy, just the basics: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a jacket in case it got cold. It was a Friday afternoon in late autumn when I decided to take a solo hike up a mountain trail I had heard about from a friend. It was supposed to be a relatively easy trail, nothing too strenuous, and I figured it would be a good way to spend the day. I knew the sun would set earlier than usual, but I didn't think it would be an issue. I had plenty of time to get to the summit and back before darkness fell. I packed my gear, slipped on my boots, and made my way to the trailhead. The hike started off easy enough. The first part of the trail was mostly flat, winding through a dense forest of pine trees. The ground was a bit muddy from the recent rain, but nothing I couldn't handle. I could hear the occasional rustle in the underbrush as small creatures moved through the fallen leaves. It was quiet, peaceful, and I could feel myself unwinding with each step. As I moved further into the woods, the trail began to rise gently. The trees thickened, their branches creating a canopy that blocked most of the sunlight, leaving everything under a soft, dappled shade. I didn't mind. It felt cool and refreshing, a nice contrast to the warmth of the day. I kept a steady pace, taking occasional breaks to drink water or nibble on a granola bar. The air smelled fresh, earthy, a little damp from the rain earlier, but still clean. After about an hour of steady climbing, the trail began to get steeper. I could feel my legs working harder as the incline increased. I was starting to sweat, but the cool air kept me from overheating. The path was narrower now, with rocks and roots sticking up in places, forcing me to be more mindful of where I stepped. I had to pay more attention to the trail, watching my feet carefully as I navigated the obstacles. But there was something else now, too. It was a feeling, a strange sensation that crawled up my spine, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't know what it was at first, but it was there, like a subtle presence that I couldn't quite identify. Maybe it was just my imagination, but it felt off, like I was being watched. I brushed the thought aside, chalking it up to the isolation of being alone in the woods. I had hiked alone before, and I knew that being alone in nature could sometimes make you feel like you were being observed by something, some animal or even your own thoughts. I pressed on, determined to make it to the top. The trail twisted around the mountain, each turn revealing new views of the valley below. The trees thinned out as I ascended, giving way to small patches of open rock and scrub. The higher I climbed, the more I noticed the sky beginning to shift colors, the pale blue of midday giving way to deeper shades as the sun started to dip lower on the horizon. I had underestimated how much time I'd spent on the way up. I glanced at my watch, 4:30 p.m. It was later than I thought, and I still wasn't at the summit. I had to make a choice now. Push on and risk coming down in the dark, or turn back. I didn't want to cut the hike short. I had come this far. So, I decided to press on, telling myself I could get back before the light completely faded. I figured the trail couldn't be much farther, and surely I could make it. As I continued up, the trail began to narrow even further. It was more rocky now, the trees fewer and farther between. The wind picked up, rustling the last of the autumn leaves. The chill of the evening began to settle in, and I found myself pulling my jacket tighter around me. The silence was overwhelming, almost oppressive, but I kept going. There was a strange sense of calm in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. It was then that I noticed something odd: footprints. They weren't human, at least not entirely. The prints were too large to be from any animal I could recognize. They looked like they could belong to a bear, but the shape was all wrong. Too broad, too deep. I squatted down to examine them, my curiosity getting the better of me. The prints were fresh, no more than a day old. I stood up quickly, unease creeping into my stomach. I wasn't too worried, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to push forward, hoping to put the strange prints out of my mind. But the further I went, the more I felt something wasn't quite right. The wind had stopped, and the silence was now deafening. I felt as though I was walking through an empty world. I hadn't passed another person in hours, and the feeling of isolation weighed on me more heavily with each step. The trail began to wind more sharply, and before long, I found myself facing a rock wall with a narrow ledge that skirted along its base. It was the kind of spot where you had to be careful, where one wrong step could send you tumbling down the slope below. I paused for a moment, staring at the ledge, considering my options. I could either carefully climb the rocks or turn back. I felt too close to the summit to turn back now, so I chose the ledge. It was narrow, and my boots scraped against the rocks as I edged my way around. My breath quickened as I focused, making sure not to look down. The drop was dizzying. As I made it around the ledge, I saw a small clearing up ahead. The summit. I had made it. The view was breathtaking. Sprawling valleys and jagged peaks stretched out in every direction, the colors of the setting sun painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. I stood there for a long while, taking it all in. It felt good to reach the top. I was alone, but in a way that made the achievement feel more personal, more rewarding. But as I stood there, that nagging feeling crept back again. The air felt wrong, as if something had shifted. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if the whole landscape had taken on a different tone. I glanced around, my heart pounding a little faster now, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. I took a few deep breaths, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. It was getting late. I had to start heading back. I turned to leave the summit, but that's when I heard it. A faint rustling sound, like something moving through the brush. My blood went cold, and I froze. I had no idea what it was, but the sound was unmistakable. Something was out there. Something was moving in the woods around me. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear it. A steady, rhythmic sound of branches snapping and leaves crunching. It was too steady to be an animal, too deliberate. My heart was racing now, adrenaline coursing through me as I spun around, scanning the trees. There was nothing, no movement, nothing to explain the noise. I wanted to ignore it, to tell myself it was just an animal, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I didn't want to stick around to find out what it was. I started back down the trail, faster now, my mind racing. The path seemed longer going down, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I tried not to look back, but the footsteps seemed to echo in the distance, growing louder as I descended. My breath came in ragged gasps now, and I stumbled over the rocks and roots, desperate to get back to the safety of the trees. But the trail seemed endless. With every step, I grew more and more frantic. The sun had dipped behind the horizon, and the darkness was closing in around me. I couldn't afford to slow down. My flashlight was in my pack, but I didn't want to stop to dig it out. I had to keep moving, had to get off the mountain. It wasn't until I finally reached the bottom of the trail, my legs burning and my mind exhausted, that I dared to look behind me. There was nothing, no sounds, no movement, just the stillness of the forest at night. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, trying to calm my racing heart. Had I just been imagining things? Had it all been in my head? I didn't know, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't coming back here. I made it back to my car as the night fully took hold, and I didn't stop driving until I was home, where I could finally breathe easy. I had no idea what had happened out there on that trail, but I was glad to be far, far away from it. I've always been an outdoors person. There's something about the stillness of the woods, the smell of pine trees, and the challenge of a long hike that makes me feel connected to something much bigger than myself. So when I found out about a new trail nearby, I couldn't wait to check it out. It was supposed to be a relatively easy hike, just a few miles up to a scenic overlook, nothing too extreme. I figured it would be a nice way to spend the afternoon. I'd been to a lot of hiking trails in the past, but this one seemed different. Not in a bad way, at least not at first. It was located in a remote part of the forest, off the beaten path. I had to park at a small lot with just a handful of cars, and from there it was a quiet walk through the trees with no one else in sight. It was early spring, so the forest was just beginning to wake up from the long winter. The ground was soft and damp, and the air smelled fresh, almost earthy. The trail started out easy enough. The path was well marked, winding through tall trees that created a canopy overhead. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting patches of warmth on the ground. I kept a steady pace, enjoying the solitude. There were no sounds except for the crunch of my boots against the earth and the occasional bird call. It was peaceful, too peaceful if I'm being honest. As I walked, I noticed that the trail was starting to narrow. The trees were growing closer together, their branches reaching out like fingers. The path was still visible, but the brush on either side was thickening. I shrugged it off at first. Nature does that sometimes, right? Trails get a little overgrown. But then something strange caught my attention. I'd been hiking for about an hour when I saw something that didn't belong. A small stone cairn, a pile of rocks stacked neatly on top of one another, was sitting off to the side of the trail. It was out of place. Most of the time, you find cairns near the base of a mountain or along a more difficult part of a trail, used to mark the path. But this one was in the middle of a flat section of forest, where the trail was clearly visible. And it wasn't the type of cairn you'd typically see either. It looked older. The rocks were worn, not sharp-edged like fresh stones. And there were other smaller stones surrounding it, placed in a circle. I stopped in my tracks and stared at it for a moment. It wasn't something that should have been there. I don't know why, but I felt uneasy. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I had an odd sensation that I wasn't supposed to be here. I shook it off and kept moving, convincing myself that it was just some other hiker's idea of a trail marker or a small memorial. But as I walked away from it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trail continued, twisting and turning, and the trees began to grow thicker. felt like the forest was closing in around me. The light through the canopy dimmed, and the temperature dropped slightly. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, feeling the weight of the silence. After another half hour or so, I reached a small creek that ran across the trail. The water was clear, but there was something about the area that felt off. It wasn't just the water or the trees. It was the stillness of everything. Normally, you'd hear the sound of insects or birds around water, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound. It was almost like the forest had gone dead. I stood at the creek for a moment, debating whether to cross it or turn back. My instincts were telling me that maybe I shouldn't continue, but something inside me pushed me forward. Curiosity, maybe, or just the desire to finish what I'd started. So, I stepped across the rocks, my boots slipping on the wet stones, and continued on the trail. It wasn't much longer before the trail started to climb. The ground became steeper, the trees more sparse. I could see the overlook in the distance, just barely visible through the trees, but as I neared it, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The air felt thicker, like it was harder to breathe, and the sounds of the forest had all but vanished. The birds were gone, and the only noise I could hear was the faint rustling of leaves underfoot. My footsteps sounded louder, like they were echoing. It wasn't right. None of it felt right. I stopped at a small clearing just before the overlook. There was a small bench there, as if someone had placed it for hikers to take a break. I sat down for a moment, catching my breath and trying to shake the odd feeling that had settled in my chest. I looked around at the trees, but nothing seemed familiar. The forest was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. That's when I heard it. At first, it was just a low, distant sound, barely audible over the rush of blood in my ears. But then it got louder, a scraping noise like something was being dragged across the ground. It was coming from deeper in the forest, somewhere beyond the trees. I stood up, heart racing, and turned to look in the direction of the sound. Nothing. There was nothing there. Just the trees, the thick underbrush, and the faint breeze swaying the branches above. I listened for a few more seconds, but the sound had stopped. I should have turned around right then and there. I should have just turned back and gone down the trail, but instead, I took a few steps forward, curiosity getting the better of me. The noise had stopped, but my unease only grew. It felt like something or someone was nearby, hidden just out of sight. I was getting close to the overlook now. I could see the clearing up ahead, a small rocky outcrop that was supposed to give you a stunning view of the valley below. But as I neared the edge, something stopped me. Something didn't look right. The air felt colder. The sky, which had been bright earlier, was now overcast and gray. The wind had picked up, and the trees swayed ominously, but still, there was no other sound. I crept closer to the edge of the overlook, where the rocks jutted out over a steep drop. I leaned forward to peer down into the valley below, and that's when I saw it. At the bottom of the cliff, barely visible through the trees, was a shape, a figure. It was standing still, just at the edge of the trees. It looked like a person, but the longer I stared, the more I realized something was wrong. The figure was too still, too rigid, as though it wasn't quite human. My pulse quickened, and I felt my stomach drop. I was sure it was watching me, though I couldn't see its face clearly. It was too far away, and the trees obscured most of its body. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a rock. I tried to steady myself, but my body was shaking. I felt trapped, like the forest was closing in around me. There was no way back the way I had come. The trail behind me was steep and winding, and something about the figure ahead made me hesitate to go any further. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at that shape in the distance. It felt like an eternity, but when I finally turned to leave, I didn't feel alone anymore. The feeling of being watched followed me all the way back down the trail. The rest of the hike back to the car was a blur. I didn't look back, not even once. When I reached my car, I got in, started the engine, and drove away as quickly as I could, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I haven't been back to that trail since, and I'm not sure I ever will. It was supposed to be a peaceful hike. I had planned it all out. One of those weekend getaways where I could just get away from the noise of the city, breathe in some fresh air, and clear my mind. The weather forecast promised nothing but sun and mild temperatures, the kind of day that would make you forget about everything back home. So, I packed my bag, grabbed my water bottle, and made my way to the trailhead by myself, something I had done dozens of times before. I loved the solitude, the quiet, the calm, the feeling of being completely alone in nature. But that day, that was different. It was an early spring morning when I arrived, just after sunrise. The sky was still streaked with pinks and oranges, and the cool air made me feel awake, alive. The trail was well marked, wide enough for a single person to walk comfortably, and covered in soft dirt and pine needles. It was a popular spot, so I wasn't expecting to be the only one out there, but I was okay with that. I had always found hiking to be a deeply personal experience, a time to connect with myself and the world around me. The first mile or so was easy. The path was gently sloping, with tall trees lining both sides, their leaves just beginning to sprout in the early spring. The air smelled fresh, earthy. Birds were singing, and there was the distant sound of a stream running somewhere off the trail. I passed a couple of other hikers who smiled as they went by. It was quiet, peaceful. But then, around the third mile, the trail began to change. The gentle slope started to steepen. The path narrowed and the trees grew thicker. The sunlight barely made it through the canopy above, and shadows stretched across the trail like long, dark fingers. The sound of birds and running water faded, replaced by a deeper quiet, the kind that wraps itself around you, making everything feel a little too still. The air grew cooler, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Although every time I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing there. I tried to shake off the unease. Maybe it was just the isolation, the quiet of the woods starting to get to me. I kept walking, trying to focus on my surroundings, the rustling of leaves beneath my feet, the smell of pine. But the farther I went, the less comfortable I felt. There was a sharpness in the air, a tension that seemed to grow with every step. I stopped to take a drink of water and wipe the sweat from my brow, trying to steady my breathing. And that's when I heard it. At first, it was so faint that I thought I was imagining it, just the wind moving through the trees. But then I heard it again, clearer this time, a rustling sound from just off the trail. I stood still, listening. The sound was coming from the bushes, somewhere just out of sight. A snap of a twig, the shift of something moving through the underbrush. Maybe a deer, I thought, or a squirrel. But then it happened again, closer this time, too close. I could feel my heart rate pick up as I tried to make sense of the noise. It wasn't the gentle rustling of leaves, not the kind of sounds you hear in nature. It was heavier, purposeful. I stood there for a moment, waiting, staring into the thick brush. The sun had disappeared behind a cloud, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer. There was no more bird song, no wind, just that oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just a small animal or the wind playing tricks. But then, as if in response to my thoughts, the rustling stopped. I took another step forward, my senses heightened, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The trail narrowed even more, and the trees on either side seemed to close in. My eyes kept darting to the side, expecting to see something moving, anything, but there was nothing. Another 100 yards or so, and the path began to split. There was a signpost, but the lettering was faded, almost unreadable. The trail ahead seemed to continue up into a steep hill, while a narrower path veered off to the left. I hesitated, standing there, staring at the two options. Part of me wanted to continue on the main trail to keep moving forward, but something about the side path called to me, seemed different, quieter, more inviting in a strange way. I couldn't explain why, but it felt like the right choice. I turned left. The path was even narrower now, the trees so dense that the sky seemed to disappear completely. The air grew colder, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. The ground was damp from the morning dew, and my boots sank slightly with every step. The trail was uneven, and I had to step carefully, avoiding roots and rocks that jutted out of the earth. With every step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, and I could feel my pulse quickening. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being silly, but the unease kept growing, like a knot tightening in my stomach. I looked up, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't much at first, just a shape in the distance, barely noticeable through the thick trunks of the trees. But then it became clearer. There was something large and dark moving through the forest, something not quite natural, like a shadow that didn't belong. It didn't look like an animal, and it certainly wasn't another hiker. It was too big, too still. It moved slowly, deliberately, and I felt my blood run cold as I watched it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to move, but my legs wouldn't obey. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a bear? Person? But no, this thing wasn't right. It didn't look like anything I had ever seen before. I started backing away, slowly at first, then faster as the shape in the trees moved closer. My feet slipped on the wet ground, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced behind me, checking for a way to escape, but the path seemed endless, and the shape kept coming closer. The sense of dread grew stronger, heavier, almost suffocating. I turned to run. My legs felt like lead, my body moving on pure instinct. The ground beneath me was uneven, and I stumbled several times, but I couldn't stop. I had to get away from whatever that was. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed myself harder. My mind focused solely on getting back to the main trail, back to safety. It felt like I ran for miles, though it was probably only a few hundred yards. Finally, I reached the fork in the trail, the one I had passed earlier. I didn't hesitate this time. I took the main trail and kept running, not daring to look back. The air was thick, and the weight in my chest didn't lift until I finally reached the clearing, where the trail widened and the trees thinned out. I stopped, leaning against a tree to catch my breath, my hands shaking. I looked around, but the path was empty. There was no sign of the shape, no rustling, nothing. Just the sound of the wind and the distant chirping of birds. My pulse slowly began to steady, and I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was it just a trick of the light, or my mind playing games with me? I couldn't say for sure, but I knew one thing. I wasn't staying out there to find out. I turned back toward the trailhead, determined to get back to my car and leave. Every step felt like a victory as I made my way down the trail. The sun was breaking through the clouds again, casting long shadows across the path, but the sense of danger had lifted. I reached the trailhead and saw my car in the distance, parked in the small lot where I had left it hours ago. When I reached the car, I didn't stop. I got in, started the engine, and drove away, the weight of the woods and whatever I had seen there still heavy in my mind. I couldn't explain it, but I didn't need to. The important thing was that I was safe. As I drove away, I glanced at the rearview mirror, and for a split second, I thought I saw something moving in the trees. But by the time I looked again, there was nothing there. I didn't go hiking for months after that. Every time I thought about it, I remembered the way the trees seemed to close in on me, the oppressive silence, and the shape that I couldn't explain. And while I never figured out exactly what I saw, I knew one thing for sure. Some places hold a presence, an energy that you can't shake, and sometimes it's better to leave that energy alone. I had always been drawn to the solitude of the mountains. The idea of disconnecting from the digital world and immersing myself in nature was both liberating and therapeutic. So, when I planned a solo hiking trip to the remote regions of the Karakoram Range in Pakistan, I was filled with anticipation. The trail I chose was less traveled, known for its breathtaking views and challenging terrain. I had done my research, packed all the essentials, and informed a friend about my itinerary. The plan was to hike for 3 days, camp under the stars, and return rejuvenated. The journey began smoothly. The trail meandered through dense pine forests, the scent of resin filling the air. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush hinted at wildlife. The path was steep in places, but manageable. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing with a panoramic view of the valley below. It was the perfect spot to set up camp. As night fell, the temperature dropped. I built a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and settled into my tent. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. I felt at peace. The next morning, I packed up and continued my journey. The trail led me to a narrow gorge, its walls towering on either side. The path became rocky, with loose stones making footing treacherous. The sun barely penetrated the depths of the gorge, casting long shadows that danced with every movement. As I ventured deeper, I noticed the silence becoming more pronounced. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own footsteps echoing off the stone walls. It was eerie, but I attributed it to the natural acoustics of the gorge. Around midday, I paused to rest and hydrate. That's when I noticed something unusual, a series of footprints in the dust, heading in the same direction as me. They were fresh, the edges crisp. I hadn't seen another soul since I started. Curious, I followed them for a while, but they eventually veered off the main path and disappeared into a thicket. 5 scary hiking stories, creepy tales from real hikers. https://outdoordept.com/scary-hiking-stories/?UTM_source=chatgpt.com. I shrugged it off, assuming it was another hiker or perhaps a local shepherd. As the day wore on, I reached a wider section of the gorge and decided to set up camp. The surroundings were quiet, almost too quiet. That night, sleep was elusive. Every creak and groan of the shifting rocks seemed amplified. I awoke early, eager to complete the final leg of my journey. The trail began to ascend, leading out of the gorge and onto a plateau. The landscape opened up, revealing a vast expanse of rugged terrain. As I trekked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I'd glance back, half expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. 5 scary hiking stories, creepy tales from real hikers. https://outdoordept.com/scary-hiking-stories/?UTM_source=chatgpt.com. Around midday, I reached a ridge that offered a view of the valley below. Relieved, I began my descent. The path was steep and covered in loose gravel. As I carefully navigated the slope, I lost my footing and tumbled several feet, landing hard on my side. Pain shot through my ankle. I tried to stand, but the pain was excruciating. I was miles from the nearest village with no cell reception. Panic set in. I assessed my supplies, limited food, a small amount of water, and a basic first aid kit. I fashioned a makeshift splint using a sturdy stick and some cloth, then used my trekking pole as a crutch. Progress was slow and agonizing. Each step sent waves of pain through my leg. As night approached, I found a sheltered spot beneath an overhang and prepared for a cold, uncomfortable night. The next morning, I resumed my painstaking descent. The terrain became more forgiving, and by midday, I spotted a faint trail of smoke in the distance. Hope surged through me. I altered my course, heading toward the smoke. 5 scary hiking stories, creepy tales from real hikers. https://outdoordept.com/scary-hiking-stories/?UTM_source=chatgpt.com. How to write a horror story. https://www.writingmastery.com/how-horror-story-5-tips-for-writing-horror-fiction?mark-UTM_source=chatgpt.com. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon a small shepherd's hut. An elderly man emerged, surprised to see me. Though we didn't share a common language, he understood my predicament. He offered me water, food, and a place to rest. Using his radio, he contacted the local authorities. Rescue arrived the following day. I was taken to a nearby clinic, where they confirmed a fractured ankle. As I recuperated, I reflected on the experience. The mountains had tested me, both physically and mentally. The solitude I had sought had turned into isolation, and the beauty of nature had revealed its indifferent side. But amidst the challenges, I found resilience. I learned the importance of preparation, the value of human connection, and the thin line between adventure and peril. While the experience was harrowing, it deepened my respect for the wilderness and the unpredictable nature of solo exploration. I had always been an avid hiker, drawn to the solitude and challenge of remote trails. The idea of disconnecting from the world, relying solely on my instincts and preparation, was both thrilling and therapeutic. So, when I heard about the newly opened trail in the northern ranges, touted as a hidden gem with breathtaking views, I couldn't resist. 5 scary hiking stories, creepy tales from real hikers. https://outdoordept.com/scary-hiking-stories/question mark UTM_source=chatgpt.com. The trail was located in a less traveled part of the mountains, known for its rugged terrain and unpredictable weather. I planned a 3-day solo hike, ensuring I had all the essentials: a detailed map, compass, GPS device, sufficient food and water, and emergency supplies. I informed a close friend about my itinerary, emphasizing the importance of alerting authorities if I didn't check in by the 4th day. The journey began smoothly. The trailhead was marked clearly, and the weather was favorable. Crisp air, clear skies, and the gentle rustle of leaves underfoot. The first day's hike was invigorating, with panoramic views of the valley below and the distant peaks ahead. I set up camp near a freshwater stream, the soothing sound of flowing water lulling me to sleep. The second day presented more challenges. The trail became steeper, with loose rocks and narrow passages. Midway through the day, clouds gathered, and a light drizzle began. I donned my rain gear and pressed on, aware that the weather could change rapidly in these parts. By late afternoon, the drizzle had turned into a steady rain, making the trail slippery and visibility poor. I decided to set up camp earlier than planned, finding a relatively flat area shielded by dense trees. As I prepared my meal, I noticed the forest had grown eerily silent. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, just the persistent patter of rain. A sense of unease settled in, but I attributed it to fatigue and the isolating effect of the weather. I awoke to a dense fog enveloping the forest. Visibility was limited to a few meters, and the trail markers were obscured. Relying on my compass and GPS, I attempted to navigate back to the trail. However, the terrain seemed unfamiliar, and landmarks I had noted previously were nowhere to be found. Hours passed as I trudged through the fog, the dampness seeping into my clothes and chilling me to the bone. My GPS device began malfunctioning, likely due to the moisture, and the compass needle wavered inconsistently. Panic started to creep in as I realized I might be lost. 5 scary hiking stories, creepy tales from real hikers. https://outdoordept.com/scary-hiking-stories/question mark UTM_source=chatgpt.com. I decided to conserve energy and set up camp, hoping the fog would lift by morning. That night, I heard distant sounds, branches snapping, a low rustling, but saw nothing through the dense mist. Sleep was elusive, my mind conjuring images of wild animals or other unseen threats. Day 4, desperation. The fog persisted, and my food supplies were dwindling. I attempted to retrace my steps, but the landscape seemed to shift, offering no recognizable features. I stumbled upon a narrow ravine with a shallow stream, deciding to follow it downhill, reasoning that it might lead to a larger water source or even civilization. The descent was treacherous, with slippery rocks and unstable footing. At one point, I lost my balance and slid several meters, scraping my hands and twisting my ankle. Pain shot through my leg, but I managed to stand, albeit with difficulty. I crafted a makeshift splint using branches and cloth from my backpack, determined to keep moving. The fog began to lift, revealing a clearer view of the surroundings. I continued following the stream, which gradually widened and deepened. By midday, I heard a distant sound. Was it a vehicle? I quickened my pace, adrenaline masking the pain in my ankle. Eventually, I emerged onto a dirt road, where a startled hiker found me and called for help. I was taken to a local hospital, treated for dehydration, minor injuries, and exhaustion. The experience left me shaken but grateful. I had underestimated the unpredictability of nature and the importance of overpreparation. From that day forward, I approached every hike with renewed respect for the wilderness, understanding that even the most seasoned adventurers are vulnerable to its challenges. I had always been drawn to the solitude of the mountains. The idea of disconnecting from the world, even for a few days, was appealing. So, when I planned a solo hike through the remote trails of the Karakoram Range, I was both excited and apprehensive. The journey began smoothly. The crisp mountain air, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots, and the distant calls of birds created a serene atmosphere. I followed the marked trail, relying on my map and compass, ensuring I stayed on course. By the third day, the weather began to change. Dark clouds gathered, and a light drizzle turned into a steady downpour. The trail became slippery, and visibility decreased. I decided to set up camp earlier than planned, finding a relatively flat area sheltered by large rocks. That night, the rain intensified. The sound of water hitting the tent was deafening. I lay awake, listening to the storm, when I heard a distinct sound. A low rumble, followed by a sharp crack, then silence. Morning revealed the aftermath. A section of the trail had been washed away by a landslide. My planned route was no longer accessible. I had to find an alternative path. Using my map, I identified a longer, less traveled trail that would eventually reconnect with the main path. It meant an additional 2 days of hiking, but it was my only option. As I ventured onto this new trail, the landscape changed. The trees grew denser and the path narrowed. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant animal calls. I felt a growing sense of unease but attributed it to the unfamiliar surroundings. 5 scary hiking stories, creepy tales from real hikers. https://outdoordept.com/scary-hiking-stories/question mark UTM_source=chatgpt.com. On the second day of this detour, I noticed subtle signs that I wasn't alone. Footprints in the mud, broken branches, and once, the faint smell of smoke. I called out, hoping to find fellow hikers, but received no response. That night, I camped near a small stream. As I prepared my meal, I felt eyes watching me. I turned quickly, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. Sleep was elusive. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves jolted me awake. The following morning, I discovered footprints circling my tent. They were human, barefoot, and fresh. Panic set in. I packed up hastily and resumed my hike, moving quickly, constantly looking over my shoulder. By late afternoon, I stumbled upon a makeshift shelter, branches and leaves arranged into a crude hut. Inside, there were remnants of food, a blanket, and a worn-out backpack. It was clear someone was living here off the grid. I decided not to linger. As I turned to leave, I heard a voice, a low, guttural sound. Not words, but a noise of displeasure. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I ran. Adrenaline fueled me as I navigated the treacherous path. I didn't stop until nightfall, when exhaustion forced me to rest. I chose a spot far from the trail, hidden among rocks, hoping to avoid any unwanted encounters. The next day, I finally reconnected with the main trail. Relief washed over me as I recognized familiar landmarks. By evening, I reached a ranger station. I reported my experience, and the rangers listened intently. They informed me that occasionally individuals choose to live in isolation in these mountains, away from society. While not illegal, it's uncommon. They assured me they'd investigate further. I completed my hike without further incident. The experience left me shaken, but also more aware of the unpredictable nature of the wilderness. It was a stark reminder that, even in solitude, you're never truly alone. I had always been drawn to the solitude of the mountains. There was something about the crisp air, the rustling leaves, and the distant call of birds that made me feel alive. So, when I heard about the newly opened trail on Pine Ridge, I knew I had to experience it. Pine Ridge was a remote area, recently opened to hikers after years of being off-limits due to conservation efforts. The trail promised breathtaking views, challenging terrains, and the kind of isolation that seasoned hikers like me craved. I planned a 3-day solo hike, aiming to cover the entire loop. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden hue over the dense forest. The air was fresh, and the scent of pine was invigorating. I adjusted my backpack, ensured my gear was secure, and began my journey. The initial part of the trail was well maintained. Tall trees lined the path, their leaves forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight, creating patterns on the forest floor. Birds chirped melodiously, and occasional rustlings in the underbrush hinted at small animals going about their day. As I progressed, the trail became steeper. Rocks jutted out, roots crisscrossed the path, and the incline tested my endurance. I paused occasionally to catch my breath and sip water, always mindful of my surroundings. The higher I climbed, the more expansive the view became. By midday, I reached a clearing that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. It was mesmerizing. I set up camp near the clearing, ensuring I was off the main trail but still within a safe distance. After a simple meal, I sat by the edge, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The tranquility was profound. I woke up to the sound of rustling leaves. Assuming it was the wind, I dismissed it and began my morning routine. After packing up, I resumed my hike. The trail now led deeper into the forest, and the path was less defined. Markers were sparse, and I had to rely heavily on my map and compass. Around midday, I noticed something peculiar. A set of footprints veered off the main trail. They were fresh, and from the size, they seemed to belong to a man. Curious, I followed them for a short distance but decided against venturing too far off my planned route. I made a mental note and continued. As the day progressed, the forest grew denser. The sunlight barely penetrated the thick foliage, casting shadows that danced with every gust of wind. The atmosphere felt different, heavier. I couldn't shake off a growing sense of unease. By late afternoon, I reached a small stream and decided to refill my water bottles. As I knelt by the water, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. I turned quickly, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. I chided myself for being paranoid and set up camp nearby. That night, sleep eluded me. Every rustle, every snap of a twig, jolted me awake. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps circling my tent. Heart pounding, I grabbed my flashlight and shone it outside. Nothing, just the stillness of the forest. Determined to finish the trail and return to civilization, I started early. The path was now treacherous, with loose rocks and steep descents. As I navigated a narrow ledge, I felt a sudden gust of wind, causing me to lose balance momentarily. Regaining composure, I pressed on. Around midday, I stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin. It wasn't marked on any of my maps. Curiosity piqued, I approached cautiously. The door was ajar, creaking with every breeze. Inside, the air was musty, filled with the scent of decay. Old furniture lay scattered, and cobwebs adorned the corners. On a table, I found a journal. Flipping through, I realized it belonged to a hiker who had ventured here years ago. His last entries spoke of being followed, of shadows in the woods, and an overwhelming sense of dread. 5 scary hiking stories, creepy tales from real hikers. https://outdoordept.com/scary-hiking-stories/question mark UTM_source=chatgpt.com. A chill ran down my spine. Was I experiencing the same? I decided to leave immediately. As I exited the cabin, I noticed fresh footprints around the perimeter, too fresh to be from the past. Panic set in. I quickened my pace, constantly looking over my shoulder. The forest seemed to close in on me. Every sound was amplified: the crunch of leaves, the snapping of twigs, the distant hoot of an owl. I felt eyes watching me, unseen but palpable. My mind raced with possibilities. Was someone else out here? Why? As dusk approached, I finally saw the trailhead in the distance. Relief washed over me. I hurried, eager to leave the forest behind. Reaching my car, I locked the doors and sat in silence, trying to process the events. Back home, I researched Pine Ridge. There were no reports of missing hikers or strange occurrences. The trail was deemed safe, yet I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was amiss. The journal, the footprints, the sense of being watched. It all pointed to an unsettling truth. 5 scary hiking stories, creepy tales from real hikers. https://outdoordept.com/scary-hiking-stories/question mark UTM_source=chatgpt.com. I decided to share my experience online, hoping to find others who might have encountered similar situations. To my surprise, several hikers responded, recounting eerily similar tales. It became evident that Pine Ridge held secrets, ones that were hidden beneath its serene facade. While I survived the ordeal, the experience changed me. I still hike, but with heightened awareness. Nature is beautiful, but it's also unpredictable. And sometimes, the most terrifying things aren't supernatural. They're the unknown elements lurking in the shadows, waiting to be discovered. I had always been drawn to the solitude of the mountains. The rugged terrains of Fort Monroe in Punjab, Pakistan, offered a perfect escape from the cacophony of city life. The plan was straightforward: a solo hike through the lesser-known trails, a chance to reconnect with nature and test my endurance. The morning was crisp, with the sun casting golden hues over the rocky outcrops. Equipped with my backpack, essentials, and a map, I began my ascent. The trail was narrow, flanked by steep drops on one side and jagged cliffs on the other. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional chirping of birds and the crunch of gravel beneath my boots. As hours passed, the trail became increasingly challenging. Loose rocks made footing precarious, and the path seemed to narrow with each step. Around midday, I reached a plateau offering a panoramic view of the valley below. The beauty was breathtaking, but a sense of unease began to creep in. Clouds gathered ominously, and the wind picked up, whispering through the crevices. Determined to reach the next checkpoint before dusk, I pressed on. The trail descended into a dense forest, where sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy. The air was damp, filled with the scent of moss and decaying leaves. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves heightened my alertness. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath me. I tumbled down a hidden slope, branches scratching my arms and face. When I finally came to a stop, pain shot through my ankle. It was sprained, possibly fractured. Panic set in as I realized my map was gone, and my phone had no signal. Nightfall approached rapidly. The forest transformed into a maze of shadows, each one playing tricks on my mind. I fashioned a makeshift splint using sticks and cloth, then hobbled to find shelter. A shallow cave offered refuge from the cold and potential predators. I rationed my food and water, hoping to be found soon. Days blurred together. Pain and hunger became constant companions. I marked each day on the cave wall, a testament to my will to survive. On the 5th day, I heard distant voices and the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Summoning all my strength, I shouted for help. Moments later, rescuers appeared, their faces a mix of relief and astonishment. Back in the safety of civilization, I learned that a sudden storm had delayed search efforts. My ordeal became a tale of caution among local hikers. The experience left scars, both physical and emotional, but also instilled a profound respect for nature's unpredictability. I never planned on hiking that far. Originally, it was just supposed to be a long weekend. 3 days of fresh air, solitude, and time away from screens and people. I picked a spot in Wyoming, about 2 hours from the nearest small town. I had been reading about this trail called Gray Elk Pass. Not very well known, a little rough around the edges, but the photos I saw online showed wide alpine meadows, old pine forests, and quiet valleys with hardly anyone around. That was exactly what I needed. I'd been working too many hours, sleeping too little, and barely speaking to anyone outside of emails. I packed light but smart. I had my tent, sleeping bag, bear spray, emergency radio, a full first aid kit, water filter, a small stove, enough food for 4 days just in case, and backup maps in case my GPS died. I had my boots broken in weeks before, and everything else felt dialed in. I left my car at a small gravel lot near the start of the trailhead around 8 a.m. on Friday morning. There were no other cars there, which didn't surprise me. This wasn't Yellowstone or Glacier. It was quieter, emptier, and the trail wasn't marked that well. I signed my name and date in the trail registry box and started walking. The first day was perfect. I moved through dense pine forests where everything smelled like cold bark and old needles. The trail went up and down in a steady rhythm, crossing over narrow creeks and climbing small ridges. Birds echoed in the branches above me, and I saw deer tracks in the muddy parts of the trail. I didn't see a single person all day, and by sunset I had made it to a small clearing near a stream where I pitched my tent. I boiled water, ate dehydrated pasta, and sat for almost an hour watching the trees go dark. I remember thinking it was almost too quiet. No cars, no hum of power lines, just water moving, wind brushing through trees, and the occasional snap of a twig somewhere in the forest. But I liked that. That was why I came. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and fell asleep before 10 p.m. The next day, I planned to follow the trail another 8 miles to a ridge that overlooked a narrow canyon. That was supposed to be the halfway point. Then I'd double back the next day and finish the loop. Everything was still going smoothly. I passed a few old trail markers carved into tree trunks and saw fresh moose tracks in a soft patch of mud. The weather stayed cool, cloudy but not threatening. Around 1 p.m., I reached the ridge, took a long break to eat jerky and trail mix, then headed down the other side into a valley. That was when things started to shift. The trail on the far side was much harder to follow. It narrowed into overgrown brush, and some parts were muddy and washed out. I pulled out my map a few times just to make sure I hadn't veered off course, but everything still looked right. The problem was that the trail stopped feeling like a trail. At times I had to duck under fallen trees or push through shoulder-high bushes. I noticed animal paths veering off into the woods, and I kept double-checking to make sure I didn't accidentally follow one. By the time I reached the bottom of the valley, it was close to 5 p.m. I needed to find a place to camp soon. The trees here were thicker, darker. I felt surrounded on all sides, and the light seemed to drop off faster between the tall trunks. I followed what I thought was still the trail and found a slightly open spot near a stand of aspens. I dropped my pack, set up the tent fast, and tried not to let my unease grow. I didn't like how quiet it was again. No birds this time, just the occasional creak of trees rubbing together in the wind. That night I didn't sleep as well. I kept hearing soft thumps outside, like something walking around. Not close, but not far either. I told myself it was deer, maybe elk. Still, I kept the bear spray right next to my head and barely slept more than an hour at a time. The next morning, I planned to hike straight out, taking the northern loop of the trail back to the gravel lot. It was about 12 miles, and I wanted to be back to my car before dark. I packed up quickly, trying to ignore the weird tension I felt in my stomach. About 3 miles into the return route, the trail disappeared completely. I wasn't lost. I still had my map and compass. The GPS worked enough to show me the general direction I needed to go, but the trail just ended in a mess of broken branches, old animal tracks, and tall grass. No markers, no worn path, just forest. I tried circling around to pick it back up, thinking I'd crossed over it without seeing. After an hour of this, I stopped, pulled out the map again, and adjusted my route. I just cut through a shallow draw and head north, staying between 2 creeks that I could see marked on the topo. If I stuck to that line, I'd eventually intersect with the trail again or hit the logging road that ran near the trailhead. I started bushwhacking, pushing through dense undergrowth. It was slower, harder, and more tiring than I expected. Everything felt steep, and there were dozens of little rises and dips in the land that weren't visible on the map. I moved for hours trying to stay focused, but I was getting more and more uneasy. Around 2 p.m., I saw something strange. Through a narrow band of trees ahead, I caught a glimpse of movement. I slowed down, dropped to a crouch, and moved carefully toward the spot. At first I thought it was a deer or maybe a person, but as I crept closer, I saw a small clearing. And in the middle of it was what looked like a very old tent. Not a hiker's tent. It was made of faded canvas, the kind you might see in photos from the 1950s. Torn in places, dirty, slumped like it hadn't been used in a long time. There were things outside it: metal cans, an old folding chair, a rusted lantern. Nothing looked new. It looked like it had been there for years, maybe decades. I scanned the area for anyone. Nothing. No sound. No signs of recent use. But the weirdest part was the fire pit. It wasn't cold. It still had black ash. Still smelled faintly like smoke. Someone had been here recently. My instincts told me to leave. Right away. I turned around and moved quickly back into the woods, circling wide and keeping my head low. I didn't know who would be camping like that this deep in the forest, off-trail, and with gear that old. Something didn't feel right about it. But as I pushed further north, the forest started to change again. The trees grew closer together. The ground got wetter, soggier. I had to climb over fallen logs constantly. The underbrush got so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead. I kept moving, kept watching the compass, but I felt like I was going in circles. Nothing matched the map anymore. The creeks weren't where they were supposed to be. Landmarks were missing. My GPS flickered, then died completely. I felt the panic start to rise. I'd hiked dozens of trails. I'd been off trail before. I knew how to navigate, but this was different. The woods felt wrong, like they were closing in, changing when I wasn't looking. I stopped to eat, drank water, and tried to calm down. I gave myself one more hour to find a landmark. Then I'd set up camp again and regroup. That was when I saw it again. The same canvas tent, same clearing, same rusted gear. There was no way I had circled back to it. I had made a wide arc, miles wide, in the opposite direction. But it was there again, in front of me, through a break in the trees. My heart started pounding. I backed up slowly, not taking my eyes off it. I turned and walked fast, then started to jog. I didn't stop until it was almost dark. I was soaked in sweat, scratched up, and completely disoriented. I couldn't find the trail. I couldn't find anything familiar. The forest just stretched in every direction like a maze. I finally picked a semi-clear area near a rocky slope and set up camp for the night, though I barely slept. Every sound outside made me jump. My flashlight caught a pair of eyes once. Maybe a fox, maybe a coyote, but I wasn't sure. I just stayed still, breathing slow, waiting for morning. The next day, I started moving before the sun fully rose. I rationed my water and food. I marked trees with my knife. I kept my compass out constantly. I moved north, always north. And then, in the afternoon, I found something else. Not the tent this time, but a cabin. A small wooden cabin tucked into a hollow, hidden by trees and brush. It was old but looked solid. There was a small porch, one window boarded up, and a door that hung crooked on one hinge. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. Something about it made me want to run, but part of me thought maybe this was a ranger's cabin or emergency shelter. I approached slowly. The door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside was dark, smelled like mold and smoke. There were old tin cans stacked in the corner, a mattress covered in dust, and papers scattered across the table. I looked through them. Most were rotted through, unreadable, but one had writing still visible. A list of names. Dozens of names, written in shaky pencil. Most were crossed out. I didn't understand it at first. Then I saw the last few names, none crossed out. Next to one of them, a note. Came from Northside Ridge 4/17. Another below it. Tent seen again April 18th. I dropped the paper. I never expected to get lost in the woods that day. It started as just a simple hike, something to clear my head and get some fresh air. I'd been feeling cooped up, tired of the usual grind, and figured a weekend in nature would do me good. So, I packed a small bag, grabbed my water bottle, and headed out to a trail I'd been on before. It was a well-trodden path, not too difficult, but long enough to be a good workout. I set out early in the morning, just as the sun was creeping over the horizon, casting long golden beams through the trees. The air was crisp, the kind of cool that made you feel alive and ready to face the day. Birds were singing, and the leaves rustled gently in the wind. Everything felt calm, peaceful, and just right. The trail was familiar, winding through thick woods with a few open clearings where the sunlight streamed through. I moved steadily along, my boots crunching on the dry, fallen leaves beneath me. I wasn't in a hurry. I didn't have a specific destination in mind. My goal was to hike for a few hours, maybe find a nice spot to sit and enjoy the view, then head back before it got too late. The world felt wide and full of possibilities. As I walked, I let my mind wander. The world had been stressful lately. Work, life, everything was building up. Out here in the forest, I could feel myself starting to relax. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just taking in the sights and sounds around me. The trail curved around a hill, and I noticed a small stream to my right. The sound of water running over rocks was soothing, and I paused for a moment to listen. I wasn't in any rush. The sun was rising higher now, and the temperature was starting to climb. I took a sip of water, feeling the cool liquid refresh me. I continued along, eventually reaching a fork in the path. One trail seemed to lead deeper into the woods, while the other curved around toward a small overlook. I'd taken the overlook trail before, so I decided to go the other way this time, curious about where it led. I figured I'd explore a bit, then turn back the way I came. First, the new trail was easy to follow. It wasn't overgrown, the path was clear, and the ground was mostly level. I was still feeling good, enjoying the hike, the solitude, and the fresh air. But as I went deeper into the woods, something started to shift. The trees grew denser. The path became less defined, the underbrush thicker. I noticed that the usual sounds of wildlife, chirping birds, rustling leaves, seemed to fade away, replaced by an eerie silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that feels peaceful. It felt heavy, almost suffocating. My feet still moved forward, but I was starting to feel a little uneasy. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But as I moved further into the forest, the feeling only grew stronger. The trees towered over me now, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The trail, which had been so clear before, was now barely discernible. I stopped a few times to check for markings or signs, but there was nothing, just trees, rocks, and dirt. At one point, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a while. I pulled out my phone to check the map, but there was no signal. The battery was also lower than I'd thought, and I knew I needed to conserve it. Panic started to creep in, but I pushed it down. I was just a little off track, nothing to worry about. I kept walking, hoping to come across a clearing or another trail junction. But the deeper I went, the more disoriented I felt. The woods seemed to close in around me, and the silence was unnerving. I could feel my heart rate quicken, and a tightness in my chest started to set in. I tried retracing my steps, but nothing looked familiar. Every tree, every rock, every bend in the path seemed the same. The forest felt endless, and the sinking realization hit me that I had no idea where I was anymore. The thought of being lost in the woods was terrifying. I tried to stay calm, but the panic was growing. I took a deep breath and forced myself to think. I knew I had to stay calm if I was going to get out of this. I checked my phone again. No service. The last thing I wanted was to get caught in the woods when it started to get dark. It was still early afternoon, but I couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away. After what felt like hours of wandering, I came across something I hadn't expected. A small, overgrown shack. It was tucked away in the trees, barely visible through the brush. My heart skipped a beat, and I hesitated for a moment. The place looked old, decades old, maybe. It had that abandoned, forgotten look. The windows were boarded up, and the roof was sagging in places. The door was half open, hanging crookedly on its hinges. Part of me wanted to turn around and keep walking, but another part of me was curious. I couldn't explain why, but I felt drawn to it. Maybe there was something useful inside. Maps, tools, even just a place to rest for a moment. I approached cautiously, my boots crunching on the dry leaves. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound sharp in the silence. Inside, the air was musty, thick with dust. The light coming through the small cracks in the boarded-up windows was dim, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. There was nothing much inside, just old furniture, a broken-down table, and some strange markings on the walls that looked like they'd been scratched into the wood. Nothing useful. I started to turn around, feeling even more unsettled now. Something about the place felt wrong, like I shouldn't be there. Then I heard it, a snap of a twig. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. The sound came from outside the shack, from the direction of the trees. I waited, holding my breath, listening. The forest was still too still. Then I heard it again. Another snap, followed by the faintest rustle of leaves. I slowly backed out of the shack, my eyes scanning the trees around me. Was someone else out here? Was I being followed? I told myself I was just overreacting, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. I needed to get out of the woods. Now, I turned and started walking briskly, then broke into a jog. The trees seemed to loom closer as I moved through them, and the feeling of being followed never left. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes, made my heart race faster. I tried not to look over my shoulder, but I couldn't help it. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and the shadows in the woods grew longer. My legs were sore from the hours of walking, but I pushed on, moving faster now, hoping I was heading in the right direction. I wasn't sure how long I had been walking, but it felt like an eternity. My body was screaming for rest, but I couldn't stop, couldn't risk it. And then, just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it, a break in the trees, a small clearing. The trail, my trail, was ahead. I stumbled toward it, relief flooding through me as I recognized the familiar markers. I had made it back. I wasn't lost anymore. The moment I stepped back onto the main trail, the tension in my body loosened. The air felt different here, lighter. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm my racing heart. I had made it. I was safe. The hike back to my car felt like a blur. I didn't stop again, didn't look back. I just walked, faster than I ever had before. By the time I reached the parking lot, the sun had almost set, and the woods were completely dark. I didn't care. I was just grateful to be out. I never found out what caused that feeling of being watched, or the strange sounds I heard in the woods, but I never hiked in that area again. The woods, as beautiful as they were, had a way of making you feel small, insignificant, and vulnerable. Maybe that was the scariest part. How easily the forest could swallow you up, how quickly it could turn from peaceful to dangerous. I learned something that day. Never take nature for granted, and never wander too far off the beaten path. The woods can be a peaceful place, but they can also be a place where you lose your way, and you never know what's waiting in the shadows. It was supposed to be a simple, easy day trip. Just a few hours out in the fresh air, away from the stress of everyday life. I had been looking forward to it for days, needing a break from work and all the noise of the city. I didn't want anything complicated, just a straightforward hike to clear my mind. The sun had just begun to climb in the sky as I made my way to the trailhead. It was a popular route, not too challenging, but long enough to make me feel like I had accomplished something. I had hiked this trail before years ago, and I remembered it as peaceful and beautiful, just what I needed. I checked my backpack one more time. Water, snacks, a first aid kit, my phone, and a jacket. Nothing too fancy. I was alone, which was exactly how I wanted it. Just me, the trees, and the winding path ahead. I started off with a steady pace, the ground beneath my boots firm and welcoming. The trail was well marked, lined with tall trees whose branches stretched high above, casting dappled shadows on the dirt. The air was cool, crisp, and smelled faintly of pine. I could hear the occasional rustling of leaves, the chirp of birds hidden among the branches, and the distant hum of insects buzzing lazily. As I walked deeper into the woods, I felt my body relax, my muscles unwinding as I moved. The world around me seemed to fade away, replaced by the simple rhythm of my footsteps. I had no agenda. I didn't need to be anywhere by a certain time. The only goal was to reach the summit and take in the view. The further I went, the less familiar the trail became. Not that it mattered. It wasn't a difficult hike, and the markers along the way assured me I was on the right path. But there was something about the silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt peaceful. It felt a bit heavier, like the air was thick with something unspoken. I shook it off, telling myself I was just overthinking things. After all, I had hiked here before. It was familiar, and there was no reason to be on edge. About an hour into the hike, I came across a section of the trail that was steeper than I remembered. The ground had eroded in some places, leaving loose rocks and dirt. I had to slow down, being careful with each step, making sure I didn't lose my footing. It wasn't anything dangerous, but it was definitely harder to navigate. When I finally reached the top of the incline, I paused to catch my breath. The view was breathtaking, just as I remembered. The valley below stretched out in a patchwork of green fields and winding rivers. The mountains in the distance were a deep blue, their peaks still capped with snow despite the warmth of the season. I spent a few minutes taking in the scenery, letting the cool air fill my lungs. But as I stood there, something caught my attention. In the distance, I saw what looked like a small cabin tucked away in a grove of trees. It wasn't marked on the trail map, and it certainly didn't look like part of the main path. My curiosity piqued. I decided to take a detour and check it out. I veered off the main trail, walking through the brush and toward the cabin. As I got closer, I could see that it wasn't a typical cabin. It was older, the wood faded and worn, with a slanted roof and ivy crawling up its sides. There was no sign of life, no smoke rising from a chimney, no movement in the windows. The silence around it was deafening, and for a moment, I wondered if anyone had lived there in years. I hesitated at the threshold but decided to take a quick look inside. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to push it open. I stepped into the dim interior, the air stale and thick with dust. The cabin was small, only a single room with a stone fireplace along one wall. The furniture was sparse, but it looked like it had been abandoned a long time ago. A few cobwebs hung from the rafters, and there was an old, rusted kettle on the stove. Nothing about it seemed particularly out of the ordinary. Still, there was a strange feeling in the air, something I couldn't quite place. It was as if the place was holding on to something, some kind of history that didn't want to be disturbed. I glanced around, feeling the weight of the stillness pressing in on me. After a few moments, I stepped back outside, breathing in the fresh air. The unease I had been trying to ignore was starting to grow. I told myself it was just the isolation of the cabin playing tricks on my mind. I wasn't afraid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to turn back and resume my hike, but as I retraced my steps toward the main trail, I realized something odd. The path I had taken to get to the cabin didn't look the same. The trees seemed different, the underbrush thicker, and the light filtering through the canopy was no longer the same shade. It was as if I had somehow wandered off course without realizing it. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. The GPS was useless out here, and I didn't recognize the area around me. I had hiked a lot in the past, and I knew that getting lost in the wilderness wasn't a good idea. My heart rate picked up a little, but I forced myself to stay calm. I retraced my steps more carefully, scanning the surroundings. Everything looked unfamiliar. I walked for what felt like hours, hoping to stumble across a sign or some familiar landmark. But the woods were relentless, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels. The sun had started to dip behind the horizon, and the temperature dropped significantly. I knew I needed to find my way back before nightfall, but the more I looked, the more everything seemed to blend together. I was losing track of time, and the weight of panic was beginning to set in. Eventually, I came across a clearing with a small stream running through it. I knelt by the water, splashing my face with the cool liquid. The rush of the stream was soothing, but the sense of isolation was still heavy in my chest. I had to keep going, had to find the trail. But where was it? I forced myself to move again, pushing through the underbrush, trying to stay calm. My legs were aching, my muscles fatigued. The thought of spending the night out here alone was terrifying. I had to keep going. It felt like hours before I finally saw a faint marker on a tree in the distance. I stumbled toward it, relief flooding through me as I realized I had found my way back to the main trail. By the time I reached the parking lot, the last of the daylight was fading. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had barely escaped something I couldn't fully understand. I had been lost in the woods, yes, but there was something else, something deeper, that made me uneasy. I never went back to that cabin. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that it was never meant to be found. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe there was something about that place that I shouldn't have disturbed. Either way, I'm just thankful I made it out of the woods before it was too late. It was supposed to be a peaceful hike, just me, the trail, and the quiet of nature. I had chosen a moderately challenging trail that looped around a remote section of the woods, about a 10-mile stretch with a good mix of elevation and open clearings. Nothing too difficult, just enough to get away for a day. The weather was perfect that morning, the sun just starting to creep over the horizon, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. I packed my backpack with all the essentials: water, snacks, my first aid kit, and a light jacket just in case the temperatures dropped later. I had done hikes like this before, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. There were trail markers every few hundred yards, and I knew that as long as I kept my eye on them, I'd be fine. By the time I hit the trailhead, it was still early, and there wasn't anyone else around. Perfect, I thought. I liked the idea of having the place to myself. I pulled my hat low over my eyes, adjusted my pack, and started down the path, listening to the crunch of gravel and dirt under my boots. The first couple of miles were easy. The trail wound through thick trees, and the canopy above kept things cool. Every now and then, I'd pass an opening, and the sun would spill through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. It was quiet, too quiet in some ways. No birds, no squirrels, no rustling in the bushes. Just the steady rhythm of my feet and the occasional gust of wind that would sweep through the treetops. About 3 miles in, I came across a narrow creek, the water flowing lazily over the rocks. I took a break there, sitting down on a large stone near the water's edge. I drank some water, grabbed a granola bar, and looked around. The trees were dense, and I could barely see more than 20 feet into the woods. But something about the place felt off. It wasn't the kind of off you could put your finger on, like a bad vibe. It was more like a small, nagging feeling that something was just wrong. I shook it off, telling myself it was probably just the isolation making me feel a little uneasy. After about 10 minutes, I packed up my things and moved on, crossing the creek on a set of rocks. The trail started to climb more sharply as I entered a section of the woods that felt older. The trees here were much larger, their bark gnarled and rough, the forest floor covered in a thick carpet of fallen leaves and pine needles. I couldn't help but notice how much darker it had gotten. The sunlight seemed to struggle to break through the canopy, and the air was heavy, almost oppressive. I checked my watch. It was a little past noon now. I had made good time so far, but something about the environment was starting to wear on me. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was suffocating. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail, and I began to wonder if maybe I'd gone too far into the backcountry. The thought crossed my mind that it might be a good idea to turn back, but I had already committed to the hike, and the end of the loop was only a few more miles ahead. I decided to push on. The further I went, the more it felt like the woods were closing in on me. The trees were so thick now that the trail was barely visible in some spots. I had to watch my step carefully, making sure I didn't trip on exposed roots or slippery rocks. The trail had become less of a defined path and more of a faint trace through the underbrush. At one point, I lost sight of the markers for a stretch of maybe a quarter of a mile. I stopped, my heart rate picking up, and scanned the area. There was nothing but trees in every direction. I thought about turning back again, but before I could make that decision, I heard something, a sound. It was faint at first, just the slightest rustling from deeper in the woods. Could have been an animal, I told myself. A deer or maybe a squirrel moving through the brush. But then I heard it again, louder this time, and it wasn't the sound of something small. This was the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Not human, at least I didn't think so, but the distinct sound of something large moving through the forest, breaking branches and shuffling through the leaves. My first thought was that it was some kind of animal, maybe a bear. But then I heard the footsteps again, closer, and my stomach dropped. I glanced around, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise, but there was nothing. The forest was still, too still, the kind of stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My instincts told me to leave, to turn around and get out of there as fast as I could. But I didn't. I kept going. Part of me wanted to know what it was, to figure out if it was a bear or something else. I thought if I stayed calm and kept my distance, it wouldn't be a problem. So I pressed on, but I kept my pace steady, my eyes darting from tree to tree, scanning for movement. A few more minutes passed, and I was almost ready to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing when I saw something. A shape moving quickly just on the edge of my vision. It was too quick to make out, but it was definitely there. My heart skipped a beat. I froze. There, through the trees, a tall figure moved across the trail. It wasn't an animal, I was sure of that. It was too upright, too human-like. But there was something wrong about it. It was almost unnatural, like it was gliding between the trunks, never fully stepping into the open. I stood there, my breath catching in my throat, trying to figure out what to do. The logical part of me screamed to run. The other part, the part that wanted to understand, wanted to know what was going on, kept me rooted to the spot. A few seconds passed, though it felt like hours, and the figure was gone, vanished into the trees. The fear I felt was like a weight on my chest. I hadn't seen anything like that before. Whatever it wasn't normal. But there was still no sound. Nothing except the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to get out. Turning quickly, I retraced my steps, walking briskly, then breaking into a jog when I couldn't take the quiet anymore. I moved as fast as I could, eyes scanning the trees, heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced with all kinds of thoughts, trying to make sense of what I had seen. My breath was ragged, and I could feel the panic rising. Then I heard something again. Footsteps much closer this time. A rustle, a snap of twigs underfoot. I glanced behind me, but there was no one there. I quickened my pace, but the noise kept following me, growing louder. And then, just as I was about to break into a full sprint, I saw it again, out of the corner of my eye, that figure just standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. I didn't stop to think. I didn't turn around. I just ran, pushing myself harder, faster than I had ever run before. My lungs burned, and my legs screamed with effort, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't afford to. The trail curved sharply ahead, and I took the turn too quickly, losing my footing and stumbling for a moment. I caught myself on a nearby tree, my heart pounding, adrenaline coursing through my veins. And then, in that moment of panic and fear, I saw the trail marker up ahead. The end of the loop was close, so close. I pushed forward, determined to get out of that forest, away from whatever it was that was following me. By the time I hit the last stretch of the trail, the footsteps had stopped. The silence was unbearable now, the sound of my own breathing the only thing I could hear. I kept my pace steady, watching the trail markers, focusing on getting back to the parking lot. When I finally made it back to my car, I didn't look back. I didn't even pause to catch my breath. I threw my pack in the trunk, jumped in the driver's seat, and sped off, not caring where I was going, just as long as it was away from that place. I didn't know what had happened out there or who or what I had seen, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never go back to that trail. Some places, I suppose, are better left unexplored. Some things better left unknown. It was an early autumn morning when I set out for the hike. The weather was perfect, cool, with a hint of crispness in the air. The kind of day where the sun is still low, casting long shadows over the trail. The leaves, already tinged with color, crunched beneath my boots, signaling the onset of fall. It wasn't my first time on this trail, but it had been a while, and something about the solitude was appealing. I didn't have any particular goal in mind. I just wanted to get out, to feel the earth beneath my feet and clear my head. It had been a stressful few months, with work piling up and personal issues gnawing at me. A day in nature was the best remedy I knew. The trailhead was quiet when I arrived, a small parking lot that held only a few cars. I tightened my backpack straps, adjusted the water bottle on the side, and made sure my phone was charged, though I knew I wouldn't need it. I hadn't planned on anything complicated, just a few hours of wandering, finding my way through the woods and maybe climbing a peak or two to get some good views. The thought of being alone, away from everything, was oddly comforting. The trail started easy, a wide path with minimal incline, mostly shaded by tall trees whose branches intertwined above, creating a cool tunnel. I had walked this way before and remembered it fondly. The forest was dense, but not so much that it felt overwhelming. The rustling of leaves, the occasional chirp of a bird, and the hum of insects filled the air. It was peaceful, almost surreal, like I had stepped into a different world where time slowed down. As I moved deeper into the woods, I started to feel that familiar sense of isolation, the kind that comes when you're truly alone in nature. It wasn't that I was afraid of being lost, not yet, but there was something in the silence that made me a little uneasy. The kind of uneasy you get when something feels a little off, but you can't put your finger on it. The trail began to narrow after a few miles. The trees grew thicker, and the ground beneath my boots became uneven, littered with rocks and roots. The air smelled damp, fresh, and earthy, almost like the forest was alive, breathing. I stopped for a moment to adjust my gear, swiping at a bead of sweat forming on my forehead. That's when I noticed it, the sound. First, it was so faint I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again. A twig snapping, barely audible, but definitely there. I paused, listening intently. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. The breeze had stopped. There was no chirping or rustling, just that eerie stillness. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. I'd been hiking alone for hours, and the fatigue was starting to get to me. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was watching me, quicken my pace. The path curved and began to ascend sharply. The higher I climbed, the more the landscape changed. The trees gave way to smaller, more gnarled ones, and patches of open ground started to appear, offering sweeping views of the valley below. The sight was stunning, and I took a moment to stop and catch my breath, letting the beauty of the scene distract me from the growing unease in my chest. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it worsened. I kept moving despite the discomfort. My feet were sore from the uneven terrain, but I told myself to push through. The higher I went, the steeper the incline became. The air thinned slightly, and I found myself taking deeper breaths to steady my pace. I had no idea how much further I had to go, but I was determined to reach the summit, to get that sense of accomplishment. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. A large rock, maybe a tree stump, but as I drew closer, I saw that it wasn't. It was a figure standing at the edge of the trail. It wasn't a person. It was something more animalistic. Its posture was odd, crouching almost like a predator, watching me. My heart skipped a beat, and my throat tightened. My instincts screamed for me to turn around, but I didn't. I stood frozen, staring at the figure, my body refusing to move, as though my legs had been locked in place. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, motionless. I couldn't make out any details. Its features were too blurred, its body too cloaked in shadow to discern anything clearly. But I felt its presence. I felt it watching me, sizing me up. My thoughts raced. I needed to get moving. I needed to leave before whatever it was decided to make a move. But I couldn't. My legs wouldn't cooperate. It was only when the figure shifted, ever so slightly, that I snapped out of my trance. I took a step back, but I was too slow. The figure, or whatever it was, made a sharp movement, turning its body toward me with unnerving speed. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. Without thinking, I spun around and ran. I could hear my boots pounding against the ground, my breath ragged and frantic. The trail felt endless, the distance between me and whatever was back there growing impossibly long. I didn't dare look behind me to check if it was following. I just ran, pushing myself harder than I ever had before. The air was thin, the rocks beneath my feet unforgiving, but I didn't stop. I wasn't sure how long I ran. Could have been minutes or hours. Time felt like it had frozen. But eventually, I reached a clearing, an open space at the top of a ridge. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, my heart still hammering in my chest. It took me a while to steady my breathing, but eventually, the panic faded. I pulled myself up and looked around, trying to get my bearings. There was no sign of anything following me. The forest stretched out before me in a vast, empty expanse. I could see the faint trail of the path below me, winding its way back into the trees. The sun was higher in the sky now, and the chill in the air had started to dissipate. Despite the fear that had gripped me, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I had made it. I had outrun whatever that thing was. And now all that was left was to descend, to find my way back down. The walk down was uneventful, though my nerves remained on edge. The trail had a different feel in reverse. The landscape seemed darker now, more oppressive. The trees loomed taller, and the shadows stretched longer across the path. When I finally made it back to the parking lot, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange light across the sky. The world felt normal again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something. I don't know what it was, whether it was some wild animal or something else entirely, but I knew one thing: I wasn't coming back to this trail again. Not alone, anyway. That night, I sat in my car for a long time, just staring at the darkening forest, my mind still reeling from the experience. I never did figure out what I saw that day, but I knew I was lucky to have made it out without encountering whatever else might have been lurking out there in the trees. As the days passed, I couldn't help but replay every moment in my head. There was a sense of relief, yes, but there was also something else, something unsettling. I had been out in the wilderness, a place meant to offer peace and escape, but instead, it had given me an encounter that left me questioning the safety of even the most familiar places. I had faced something I couldn't explain, something I couldn't forget, and that was enough to make me realize that not all trails are meant to be hiked, not all paths are safe, and not all encounters end with a happy return. I had never really been into hiking before, but something about that weekend made me want to try it. I had been cooped up in my small apartment for weeks, trying to get work done and avoid the world outside. The constant hum of city life, the noise, the crowds. It was all starting to get to me. So, when I saw an ad for a trail not too far from where I lived, I figured, why not? A weekend getaway in nature seemed like the perfect escape. The trail was located in a national park about an hour's drive from my apartment. I had no real idea of what to expect, but I didn't want to do a super intense hike. I picked a moderate route, a loop trail that promised stunning views without being too strenuous. It wasn't overly crowded either, which I liked. Sometimes you just want to get away from people and be alone with your thoughts. I packed up the car with a few essentials: water, snacks, my camera, and a first aid kit. I didn't plan on doing anything risky, but I thought it was better to be prepared. The drive out there was peaceful, though I started to get a bit nervous as I approached the park. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had no idea what I was doing, that maybe I had overestimated my ability. I've always been a bit of a homebody, and hiking was foreign to me. I arrived at the park just after noon, and the parking lot was fairly empty, which was a good sign. The weather was clear, the air smelled fresh, and everything seemed perfect. I took a deep breath as I grabbed my gear and started walking toward the trailhead. A sign greeted me with basic information about the trail and a warning to be aware of wildlife. My stomach churned a little when I saw the part about bears, but I brushed it off. People hike these trails all the time, right? The first few miles were beautiful, wide, well-maintained paths with towering trees and dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. The sounds of birds chirping and the rustling of the wind in the branches helped put me at ease. I felt a sense of calm wash over me, like I had found some kind of peace I hadn't realized I was missing. But that peace didn't last long. I must have been about 3 miles into the hike when things started to feel off. The trail began to narrow, and the trees grew thicker around me, blocking out more of the sunlight. The air felt heavier, the quiet more pronounced. I looked around and saw nothing unusual, just the wilderness, which, in hindsight, should have been a red flag. You never realize how quiet the world gets when you're truly alone in it. I tried to push those feelings aside, telling myself it was just my nerves. The thought of being out here alone started to gnaw at me. I wasn't exactly scared, but there was a sense of discomfort creeping in. A noise, something faint but distinctly unnatural, came from behind me, like a rustle or a snap of a twig. I froze for a moment, half expecting to see someone coming up the trail behind me. But when I turned around, there was nothing. The trail stretched out behind me, empty. I shook it off as my mind playing tricks. After all, I had heard animals rustling around earlier, so it was probably just a squirrel or something. But then the feeling got worse. It was hard to explain, but it was like the woods were closing in on me. The trail, once wide and inviting, now felt confining and tight. Every turn, every bend in the path seemed to make the woods feel more oppressive. The silence became suffocating, and with each step, my unease grew. I pushed on, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. The trail wasn't difficult, but the growing sense of discomfort made every step feel like a burden. I took another glance behind me, just to check. Nothing. But then, just as I turned my gaze forward, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a flash of movement among the trees. I snapped my head toward the spot, but the moment I did, whatever I had seen was gone. It was too fast to make out, but it was there. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer or something, but the rational part of my brain had started to take a back seat to something else. Anxiety. My pulse quickened. The trail took a sharp turn to the left, leading me into a denser part of the forest. The trees were thicker here, and the sunlight barely touched the ground. It was colder, too. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself and kept walking, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that was hanging over me like a cloud. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting someone to be following me, though I knew I hadn't seen anyone on the trail the entire time. That was when I heard it again, the faint snap of a twig. This time, it was closer. I stopped in my tracks and turned around, heart racing. There was no one, but something in my gut told me something wasn't right. I'd been out in the woods enough times to know that animals make noise. Sure, but they don't usually follow you, and they certainly don't stay quiet until you've been listening for them. My hand instinctively went to my phone, but I realized I had no signal. I wasn't lost, not exactly, but if something happened, I would be completely alone. I couldn't help but feel small and insignificant, like I was no longer in control of my surroundings. The trees, the rocks, the earth, it all felt so indifferent to me now. I kept moving forward, trying to push the panic out of my mind, but the trail seemed to stretch on forever. The woods felt darker, the path narrower, and I began to hear the sounds of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and following my pace. First, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but then the steps got closer. It was unmistakable now. Someone or something was behind me, quickened my pace, heart hammering in my chest. The crunching of leaves underfoot grew louder, matching my speed. I didn't dare look back this time. If I did, I was afraid I would see something that I wasn't ready to face. My legs burned, and I started to breathe harder, but I kept going. The trail began to descend into a valley, and I was relieved. It was all downhill from here, and maybe I'd get some better reception or find a ranger station. But the feeling didn't let up. In fact, it intensified. The footsteps behind me grew closer, the sound of them almost in sync with my own. That was when I noticed the silence. The usual hum of the forest, birds, wind, rustling leaves, had all but disappeared. It was dead quiet save for those footsteps. I could feel my breath catch in my throat as I looked over my shoulder. Nothing. But the moment I looked away, I felt it. A hand on my shoulder, a cold, firm grip that jolted me forward. I spun around, expecting to see someone there, but no one was there. My mind raced, but the rational part of me couldn't make sense of it. I was alone, right? My pulse was pounding in my ears as I broke into a sprint, tears welling up in my eyes. This wasn't a bad hike anymore. This was a nightmare. I ran, faster than I had ever run before, until my legs couldn't carry me anymore. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, hands shaking. The world spun around me, and for a moment, I thought I might faint. But then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The footsteps, the eerie feeling, everything. There was nothing but the distant sound of the wind and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. I lay there for what felt like forever, staring up at the sky through the branches of the trees. The trail, once terrifying, now felt strangely welcoming. The panic slowly melted away, replaced with an overwhelming sense of relief. I wasn't sure what had just happened, but I was alive. And for the first time in what felt like hours, I wasn't afraid. I slowly got to my feet, dusted myself off, and continued down the trail. It took me another hour to get to the parking lot, but by the time I arrived, the sun was setting, and I couldn't help but look around one last time. Everything seemed calm. It was as though nothing had happened at all. The drive home was quiet, and the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. The fear had subsided, but I knew I would never forget that hike. Those footsteps, the cold grip on my shoulder, the feeling of being hunted. I didn't know what it was or what it meant, but I wasn't ready to go back into those woods again.